Hey guys, so tonight we're going back, way back, like prehistory back. You're going to stroll through myths, dig around ancient laws, and peek behind the curtains of sacred temples, dusty courtrooms, and probably more than one very awkward public punishment. And, yep, you probably won't survive this. Not because someone's swinging an axe, though sometimes they do, but because the amount of shame, rules, and religious panic surrounding S3X through history, it's absurd, hilarious, terrifying, usually all three. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not trying to end up in your algorithm guilt pile. Also, tell me what city you're watching from and what time it is right now. I like knowing which time zone we're spiraling into together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not in a courtroom, not a dungeon, not even a palace. You're in a garden, and not just any garden, the garden. Lush, dew-sparkled leaves, orchards just kind of handing you snacks, a breeze soft enough to feel designed, and there you are, unclothed but unbothered. So is your companion. No shame, no rules, no pants. Life is good, until it isn't. One choice, just one curious bite, and suddenly you're aware of everything. Your own body, theirs, the fact that you're naked, the fact that that might mean something. Somewhere in the rustling of fig leaves is the sound of human history clicking into place. Shame has entered the chat. The story of Adam and Eve might not be your bedtime go-to, but let's be real. It's one of the most influential origin stories ever told. Not just because of the talking snake or the original fruit salad, but because of the immediate link between desire and punishment. The knowledge of good and evil is pretty obviously code for something else, something stickier. And suddenly, S3X isn't just natural, it's criminal, or at least morally loaded. Here's the historical fact. Many scholars believe Genesis wasn't written to be a factual record, but a theological myth layered with cultural anxiety. Ancient Hebrew culture, surrounded by Canaanite fertility religions and big sensual goddess statues, needed to define itself against what it saw as dangerous permissiveness. The Eden narrative is less a universal truth, more like a cultural reset button. Don't be like those other tribes. Cover yourselves. You and Eve, or Adam, we don't judge here, make a break for it. You're out of paradise and into the wild, exiled. But more importantly, you're suddenly human, and with that comes your first brush with regulated intimacy. From now on, sex isn't just about connection or pleasure. It's about control, lineage, and the 1,000 rules people will soon invent to make sure it stays in the right box. Fast forward a few hundred generations and the fruit of that story, pun intended, still hangs over every culture that inherits Abrahamic ideas. You'll start to notice how many origin myths around the world throw in some "oops, we had sex" as a pivotal turning point. In Greek mythology, Pandora opens her box. In Mesopotamia, Enkidu becomes civilized after sleeping with a temple priestess. Over and over, intimacy is seen as something that wakes you up, but not in a good way. More like, wakes you up into taxes, patriarchy, and a lifetime of shame spirals. Here's your quirky fact. In some early Jewish mysticism, Adam actually had a first wife before Eve. Her name was Lilith. According to the legends, she refused to lie beneath Adam, interpreted as both literally and symbolically. So she got kicked out of Eden. Later lore paints her as a demon who steals babies and seduces men in their sleep. Basically, she got cancelled by Genesis for being too sexually independent. Already the stakes are clear. Obedient sex is fine, but deviant sex, whether that means the wrong position, the wrong partner, or just wanting something on your own terms, gets mythologized as evil. Or punished. Usually both. And it only escalates from here. You start to see patterns. In myth, unregulated intimacy causes chaos, floods, wars, plagues. In law, it becomes a public matter. Who you sleep with isn't just your business, it's your villages, your religions, your kings, and eventually your governments. Because intimacy leads to babies, and babies need fathers, and fathers need to know who owns what. So the rules begin to harden, and the punishments sharpen. But here's the scholarly debate. Was the Garden of Eden story really about sex at all? Some theologians argue that the knowledge of good and evil had nothing to do with bodies or desire, but was about autonomy, independence from God, a desire to self-direct. If that's true, the shame wasn't about nudity, it was about rebellion. But then, why the fig leaves? Why is the first realization not, oh no, I betrayed my creator, but oh no, I have genitals? It's not exactly a leap to say sex got tangled into the earliest concepts of guilt, and from there, things only get more elaborate, more policed, more violent. But you're still just a human in a garden, trying to make sense of what just happened. You've got a leaf over your hips, a new sense of vulnerability, and a long road of legal systems, religious edicts, and awkward cultural taboos ahead of you. And that apple you bit? Turns out it had paperwork attached. You're not in Eden anymore. Now you're walking through dust-coloured streets, past clay brick homes, past ziggurats that climb the sky like stairways for gods. Welcome to ancient Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, where civilization is just figuring itself out, and already, S3X is both sacred and suspicious. You can smell the incense drifting out from a temple complex. It's not just a place of worship, it's where people go to experience the divine through, well, very physical means. Here's the twist. In certain Mesopotamian cultures, S3X wasn't just permitted, it was required, ritualized, holy. The goddess Inanna, or Ishtar depending on which city-state you're in, was served by priestesses and sacred sex workers. Pilgrims could come and offer themselves money, goods, sometimes more, in exchange for a night that was supposed to mirror the union between mortal and divine. Imagine that. You enter a temple not to pray, but to get spiritually entangled with someone representing a goddess. That was called sacred marriage, and it was a thing. And now this might sound like a utopia compared to the shame spiral you just crawled out of in Eden. But slow your sandals, because while some people, usually elite men, got to enjoy that so-called holy access, others faced a much harsher version of morality. Laws like those in the Code of Hammurabi laid it out pretty clearly. Adultery, depending on your gender and class, could get you drowned in a river, or buried alive, or shamed in public. Not exactly a two-way street. Let's talk about one of those laws. If a woman was accused of cheating and couldn't prove her innocence, she might be forced to undergo an ordeal, like walking into the river and hoping the gods let her float instead of drown. A literal sink or swim test for morality. Meanwhile, if a man was caught with someone else's wife, well, if he was powerful enough, the consequences could be negotiable. Power and punishment were deeply tangled, and justice came with a sliding scale. So here's your historical fact. The Code of Hammurabi, written around 1750 BCE, was one of the first known legal systems to criminalize S3X outside of marriage. But it didn't criminalize it evenly. Men had more leeway, especially if they were upper class. Women, particularly married women, bore the brunt of the suspicion and shame. Fidelity wasn't about fairness. It was about property, inheritance, and honour. Basically, whose baby is this, and can he inherit goats? But now here's the quirky fact. In some city-states, young women, before marriage, were expected to serve in the temple for a short time. Some historians argue this was a kind of sacred prostitution, where every woman would symbolically offer herself to a stranger in honour of Inanna. Others push back hard, saying this was more symbolic than literal, and those claims came from Greek and Roman writers who didn't exactly have neutral eyes on Eastern cultures. Either way, the very idea that sexuality could be seen as divine, and yet still get you executed under the wrong circumstances, is very, very Mesopotamian. You notice a pattern here again. Sex isn't private, it's ritualized, codified, and enforced. It's used to reinforce class structure. Your body, especially if you're female, isn't really yours. It belongs to your father, then your husband, and above all to the gods. This isn't about intimacy. It's about order, about keeping civilization from fraying at the edges. And yet desire persists. You hear it in poetry, in prayers, in love songs carved into tablets. One of the oldest recorded poems in history? It's erotic. A hymn from a bride to her king, written in first person, describing their union in graphic metaphor-laced delight. You can practically hear the harp music. The words are thousands of years old, but you can almost hear the heartbeat behind them. So even under layers of law and sacred obligation, people are still just people, still yearning, still sneaking glances at the wrong person across a courtyard. Now here's the scholarly debate. Did temple sex workers truly exist, or is it all exaggerated? Some researchers argue that the idea of sacred prostitution is a misreading of poetic metaphors and outsider reports, that it was more about ritualized dance, prayer or performance than actual intercourse. Others insist it was real, institutional, and widely practiced. The truth is probably somewhere in the dust between tablets. Archaeologists keep finding references, but no smoking sandal. And honestly, that ambiguity tells you something important. Even the historians can't agree on how people regulated S3X in the past. The records are old, damaged, or filtered through male scribes with their own biases. But what you can see, clearly, is that for as long as there have been laws about sex. And for as long as there have been laws about sex, someone's been breaking them. So tonight, as you drift through the alleys of Ur or sip date wine under Babylonian stars, remember, you're not just walking through an ancient city, you're walking through an early experiment in controlling desire, one that blessed and punished S3X in the same breath, one that made love sacred in the temple and criminal in the home. You're starting to realise, we've always had complicated feelings about pleasure, and unfortunately we've always had even more complicated punishments. You leave the dusty streets of Mesopotamia behind, and now the air grows heavier, hotter. The Nile glides by under a low pink sun, and papyrus rustles at the edges of the riverbank. You're in ancient Egypt now, and things are different here. A little more gilded, a little more wrapped in linen. But don't get too comfortable. The contradictions only get sharper. Because here, S3X is simultaneously divine, dangerous, and deeply tangled in royal blood. Let's start with the royals. You're invited to a dinner party at the palace, and seated beside you are two siblings, Pharaoh and his queen. Also his sister. Yeah, that part's not a rumour. Royal incest wasn't just allowed, it was encouraged. Why? Because the gods did it first. According to Egyptian mythology, Isis married her brother Osiris, and their union birthed divine kingship itself. So when the pharaoh takes his sister as wife, it's not scandalous, it's sacred. Here's your historical fact. Sibling marriage was practiced among Egyptian royalty for over 1,000 years, not occasionally, routinely. Even Cleopatra, generations later, married her brothers. The logic wasn't emotional, it was political, keeping power in the family, avoiding alliances that might fracture the throne. Your inheritance stays neat and tidy, like your tombs. But don't get the wrong idea. This was never normalised for commoners. If you were a peasant farmer, marrying your sibling was still a no-go. That kind of closeness was reserved for gods and god-kings. But now things get interesting. Because while elite family unions were protected, S3X outside of marriage, especially if it crossed social class lines, was absolutely criminal. If you were caught in adultery, and especially if you were a woman, punishment could be brutal. A nobleman might lose his position. A servant, whipped, a queen. Legend has it, one royal wife was burned alive for betraying her husband. So just to be clear, incest? Okay. Adultery? Absolutely not. Egypt was all about keeping power pure, but bodies tightly regulated. Now here's a quirky fact for your bedtime brain. There was a spell in the Book of the Dead designed to help the deceased regrow their sexual organs in the afterlife. Not kidding. Egyptians were so invested in carrying their physical selves into eternity that amulets and prayers were crafted to ensure you'd arrive in the next world fully functional. Which suggests two things. One, they didn't think desire stopped at death, and two, they wanted to keep their options open. You walk through a market now past vendors selling fish, linen and strange perfumes. A woman passes by wearing a sheer tunic, and no one blinks. Public nudity wasn't taboo in the same way it would become in other cultures. The female form wasn't hidden. It was styled, celebrated, sometimes even painted erotically on tomb walls. But here's the contradiction again. Just because beauty and sensuality were visible didn't mean desire was freely expressed. It was still channeled, controlled, framed by very specific rules. Sex was also tangled up in magic. Love spells, fertility charms, and curses involving bodily fluids show up in medical papyri. One scroll describes how to keep a man from straying using crocodile dung and some, very personal ingredients. Ancient Egypt didn't separate magic from medicine from daily life. Everything was spiritual, including your love life. But here's the scholarly debate. Were Egyptian women sexually liberated compared to their Mesopotamian counterparts? Some say yes. They could own property, initiate divorce, and even sue their husbands. Others argue that while the laws looked progressive on paper, social norms kept women in extremely controlled roles, especially in terms of sexuality. What we read in tomb inscriptions doesn't always match what happened in kitchen courtyards and back alleys. The truth, like a half-decayed scroll, is partially lost. Still, the evidence suggests that women, particularly elite women, had more leverage here than in many later societies. A woman could reject a marriage proposal. She could testify in court. She could write erotic poetry and have it preserved on papyrus. One surviving poem literally says, "I want to hold you like a liar." If that's not a 3,000-year-old thirst trap, what is? But again, context is everything. Because while a wealthy woman might have some legal autonomy, a servant girl caught in the wrong bed could still be disfigured or sold off. Egypt, like everywhere else, had different rules for different people, and the line between sacred and sinful was often less about the act, and more about the status of who was doing it. You make your way past the temples now, where high priests are preparing rituals. Some are celibate, others are not. The gods themselves had elaborate sexual lives. Set and Horus had a particularly disturbing contest involving, let's just say, bodily trickery and a lettuce salad. If you're curious, look it up after the lights are back on. Let's just say Egyptian myth didn't shy away from the strange and squishy. But myth aside, the Egyptians were early architects of sexual governance. They gave us a model where the divine and the carnal coexist, but only if you follow the rules, and if you didn't, you could find yourself cursed, mutilated, or erased from the official record entirely. And yet, in quiet moments, lovers still met by the reeds. Someone still slipped into someone else's courtyard after dark. Human desire didn't care about scrolls or tomb curses or royal bloodlines. It showed up anyway, under the stars by the river, with a heartbeat as steady as the Nile. So as you slip into your linen sheets tonight, you leave Egypt with a new understanding. Even in a society that wrapped bodies in gold and linen, the same old rules applied. Pleasure was fine, as long as it served power. Intimacy was sacred, unless it threatened the order. And history, already, is showing just how complicated being human really is. You don't even notice the shift at first. The sun is still warm, the wine still flows, and the scent of olive oil still drifts through the breeze. But now the buildings have white marble columns, the men wear chitons, and someone is passionately debating philosophy in the corner while very much ignoring his wife. Welcome to ancient Greece, where love is a battlefield, and desire is ranked, labelled, praised, or punished depending entirely on who you are, what your body looks like, and what role you're supposed to play. You're sitting in the symposium now, a boozy upper-class sleepover with poetry, snacks, and more than a little strategic flirting. Around you, men recline on couches, sipping watered-down wine, laughing too loudly. This isn't just a party, it's a social ritual, where bonds are formed and reputations are made. And yes, S3X is on the menu, but not just any kind. Here's the historical fact. In classical Athens, male-male relationships were not only tolerated, they were often idealized. Older men, called Erastes, would court younger boys, called Eromenos, in relationships that were partly educational, partly mentorship, and yes, partly sexual. This wasn't a fringe practice. It was a cultural norm among the elite. Philosophers like Plato even wrote about it as the highest form of love, untainted by the complications of reproduction or domestic squabbles. In the symposium, love between men is presented as spiritually superior. But before you pull out the pride flag, remember, this wasn't equality. It was hierarchy. The older man pursued, the younger man submitted. The status roles were strict, and the relationship was expected to mature into something platonic over time. Women, rarely mentioned in these lofty speeches about love, and when they were, it wasn't always kind. Here's your quirky fact. Ancient Greek doctors believed that a woman's uterus could literally wander around her body if she didn't have enough sex. Hysteria, they called it. If she got too emotional or sickly, they assumed her womb had gotten bored and gone exploring. The cure? Marriage and babies, lots of them. So while male sexuality was idealized as philosophical and pure, female desire was treated like a ticking time bomb of irrationality. You leave the symposium and wander through the city. In Athens, respectable women are mostly out of sight, kept at home, veiled, managing the household and producing heirs. Meanwhile, courtesans, hetairai, walk freely, attend parties, and even engage in political conversation. They're educated, witty, and sexually autonomous, but also completely outside the protection of marriage or citizenship. It's a bizarre split. The wife is for making babies and managing linens, the courtesan is for pleasure and poetry, and neither is fully free. Now here's the debate. Was ancient Greek society sexually liberal, or just deeply stratified? Some argue that their openness about male-male desire and erotic art shows a culture of acceptance. Others say that acceptance only applied to free men in specific social roles, and everyone else was placed into narrow, punishing boxes. Enslaved people, women, and anyone who didn't play their part exactly right. Not so liberated. You make your way past a theatre where a raunchy comedy is in full swing. The playwright Aristophanes is not pulling punches. His characters are talking about giant phalluses, cheating wives, and absurd legal cases involving, no joke, misplaced semen. The crowd loves it. Greek theatre was not shy, but again, performance is one thing, reality is another. Let's talk adultery laws. If a married woman was caught with another man, it wasn't just a scandal, it was a legal crisis. Her husband was expected to divorce her immediately. The lover could be killed on the spot legally by the husband or her male relatives, and she could be banned from all public religious ceremonies, basically erased from respectable society. It was less about morality and more about lineage. If a child was born from that affair, it could throw inheritance into chaos. Once again, we see that control of women's sexuality is actually about property. Men, though. A married man could sleep with a courtesan or a slave, no problem. As long as the woman wasn't a citizen, no law was broken. The double standard was written into the bones of the city, and no amount of olive oil or philosophy could smooth that over. Even so, desire refused to be boxed in. We have ancient graffiti carved into stone walls declaring love or lust in quick, messy inscriptions. I was here, and so was Thaleia, one reads. Others list body parts and suggestive scenarios with zero subtlety. Just because poets and lawmakers wanted love to be lofty, didn't mean everyday people weren't hooking up in alleyways after sunset. There's also something strangely modern about some of the Greek debates. Philosophers argued over whether desire was a weakness or a virtue, whether the gods themselves were ruled by lust, whether love was madness or clarity. These are conversations people still have, even if now it's in therapy or on Reddit. But the Greeks had a peculiar anxiety, that unregulated pleasure might unbalance the soul. Plato warned that too much lust made a man less rational, less ideal. Aristotle said that a good citizen had to control his appetites, especially the bodily ones. You were supposed to enjoy love, yes, but only the right kind, in the right context, with the right person. And if you strayed from that, social shame, legal trouble, maybe worse. So here you are, at the heart of a civilization that gave the world democracy, drama, and the word erotic. And yet, it still built elaborate systems to contain something as basic as desire. Women's sexuality was regulated to absurd degrees, male intimacy was ranked and boxed, and anyone who blurred the lines risked ridicule or punishment. Still, somewhere near the Acropolis, you pass a young couple whispering in the shadows. Maybe he's courting her with poetry. Maybe she's slipping out past curfew. Maybe they both know the rules and are breaking them anyway. Because no matter how many laws are written, or plays are staged, or doctors ramble on about travelling wombs, people still find each other in the dark. And tonight, under a sky full of stars and philosophy, you realise that even the great minds of Greece couldn't quite figure out what to do with love, lust, or the human body. You're still trailing the footsteps of ancient empires, but now your sandals hit colder stone. The air is heavier. You hear the clang of swords, the shouts of a crowd, and maybe the faint splash of wine or blood. Welcome to Rome, where everything is bigger. The buildings, the egos, and yep, the hypocrisy. Because the Romans, more than almost any civilization before them, loved to talk a big game about morality, while secretly doing whatever they wanted behind their enormous marble doors. You walk down a Roman street, paved and surprisingly smooth by the way, and past graffiti that would make modern Twitter blush. Romans wrote about sex on everything, walls, pottery, statues. They didn't whisper about it, they carved it into public restrooms. But don't let the open attitude fool you. The Roman Empire had laws about sex, serious ones. They just didn't apply to everyone equally. Here's your historical fact. Under Emperor Augustus, the same guy who liked to brag about restoring Roman virtue, Laws were passed to punish adultery. The Lex Julia de Adulterius Coascendis wasn't just about keeping up appearances, it made cheating a public crime, not just a private scandal. If a woman was caught in adultery, her father could legally kill her lover. Her husband could divorce her and take her dowry. She could even be exiled to an island. Yes, literally banished to an island. For sex. Not even bad sex, just unsanctioned sex. Now let's zoom in on that hypocrisy part. Because men, especially elite men, they were rarely held to the same standard. Roman men could legally sleep with their slaves, concubines, or prostitutes without consequence, as long as those partners were lower class and not married to someone else. And as long as the Roman man played the dominant role. If he didn't, oh boy, then it got scandalous. Because here's a quirky little Roman rule. It wasn't just about who you slept with, it was about how. A free Roman citizen was expected to be the penetrator, never the penetrated. That wasn't just a preference, it was law, social status, identity. A man who willingly took the passive role could be mocked, lose respect, even be disqualified from public office. The act itself wasn't illegal, but being too into it in the wrong way was. So yes, Rome invented slut-shaming, power dynamics, and probably the first awkward locker room jokes. You're now passing a brothel in Pompeii. The paintings on the wall are shockingly vivid, every position catalogued like it's a menu. Prostitutes worked under state oversight. They were registered, taxed, and confined to their social category. No upward mobility, no respect. But they were a recognised part of Roman life. Even emperors visited in disguise or not. It was accepted, even expected, just never romanticised. Here's a little-known detail. Brothels sometimes had stage names etched over the doors of the women working there. Things like Fortunata, Lucky Girl, or Chloris, Green One. But those names weren't cute. They were protection, a way to avoid using a real name in a society where being named in a sex scandal could follow you forever. Still, desire didn't stay within legal lanes. It leaked into poetry, politics, and scandal. The poet Ovid, for example, wrote a detailed guide called Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, that basically told men how to seduce women, avoid their husbands, and manipulate emotions for fun. The government didn't love that. In fact, Augustus exiled Ovid, allegedly for a poem and a mistake. That mistake, possibly advising men how to cheat on their wives. In a moralist regime, writing about sex could get you booted from the capital. But not everyone was playing the love game for fun. Women, especially those without money or status, were often trapped in systems they couldn't escape. Enslaved people had no legal rights to their own bodies. They could be used, bought and discarded at their master's whim. If a slave woman got pregnant, her child was automatically a slave too. There was no legal concept of consent for them, only ownership. And still, despite all this structure, real love happened. Secret affairs, whispered poetry, hidden relationships that bent the rules. There's a preserved love letter found in the ruins of Vindolanda, a Roman fort in northern Britain, where a woman invites her lover to a birthday party. It's personal, warm, flirty. Even in the harsh edges of empire, intimacy found a way to sneak through the cracks. Now here's the scholarly debate. Were Roman sex laws more about moral panic or social control? Some argue that Augustus genuinely wanted to restore family values after years of civil war and decadence. Others say it was a power move to consolidate control over elite families and their alliances. After all, if you could accuse a senator's wife of adultery, you could wreck his political career. Morality and manipulation made a very Roman couple. You pass a statue now, marble, idealised, impossibly smooth. A man with muscles like they were designed by gods, standing nude in the forum. No one is scandalised. Nudity in art wasn't considered erotic, it was heroic. But in real life, a woman showing her ankle could spark gossip. Again, the rules are less about logic and more about image. Romans had entire books on how a respectable woman should behave. Quiet, modest, fertile. Meanwhile, men could live out wild affairs and still get statues. You find yourself walking past the ruins of a home once owned by a wealthy senator. Beautiful mosaic floors, columns, frescoes. In the private quarters, erotic images decorate the walls. Not hidden, but not public either. These weren't meant to scandalise. They were just life. And yet, the people who lived here lived in fear of being accused of improper behaviour, of scandal, of exile. Rome at its heart wanted to have its cake and moralize it too. It was a world where desire was normal, but never equal, where laws were passed by men who regularly broke them, where women were policed for purity and men were praised for conquest. You've seen this play before, and you'll see it again. So tonight, as the Colosseum looms behind you and the echoes of gladiators fade into dusk, you understand something. Rome didn't criminalize sex because it was dangerous. It criminalized it because it was powerful. And anything powerful in the hands of the wrong person, especially someone not male, not elite, not controllable, had to be legislated, punished, or erased. Sound familiar? The empire falls around you, not with a bang, but with centuries of slow crumble. Roman roads crack, temples are abandoned, and suddenly, robes are swapped for rough wool cloaks. You're no longer walking through marble forums, you're trudging through candlelit catacombs and stone churches. Welcome to the early Christian world, where sex hasn't just been regulated, it's been put on trial, wrapped in guilt, and locked away behind the pearly gates of chastity. You duck into a dimly lit room. It smells like incense and damp earth. A group of people kneel, whispering prayers. Among them is a girl, young, solemn, with a look that's equal parts terrified and transcendent. She's a virgin martyr. That's not just a poetic label, it's a category, a spiritual job title. In the early centuries of Christianity, young women who refused marriage and sex were considered heroes, saints even. Not because they did something, but because they refused to. Here's your historical fact. During the Roman Empire's transition into Christianity, some of the most celebrated saints were virgin girls who died rather than lose their chastity. Saints like Agnes, Cecilia, and Lucy became legends not for preaching or performing miracles, but for saying no to sex, even when that meant torture or execution. Their purity was seen as a kind of superpower, the holier-than-thou origin story. Let that sink in. You become a religious icon not for what you do, but for what you don't do, for being untouched, for being unbroken. The highest spiritual achievement for a woman? Abstinence. That's not just a cultural value, it's a theology. But here's the twist. While virginity was elevated to sainthood, sexuality was increasingly painted as sinful. And not just in action, in thought, in dreams, in body language. You could be guilty without ever touching anyone. The crime lived in your mind, and the punishment was shame, confession, or eternal damnation. Welcome to the birthplace of thought crime. You're walking now through a monastic garden. Everything's quiet except for the chanting of monks. These are the first people to make celibacy a profession. Entire communities built around not having sex. And yes, they meant it. Strict rules, separate sleeping quarters, and punishments for even thinking the wrong thought during morning prayers. The idea was clear. To be closer to God, you had to move away from your body, away from pleasure, away from other people. Holiness became isolation, but not everyone bought in. Here's your quirky fact. In the early centuries, some Christians practiced spiritual marriage, a kind of cohabitation where a man and woman lived together in total chastity. No sex, no touching, just vibes and prayer. It was supposed to prove spiritual discipline, and yet, surprise, many of these arrangements ended in scandal when it turned out the spiritual part was more aspirational than actual. As you move deeper into this era, you start to notice something. The Christian worldview wasn't just anti-sex, it was anti-body. The body was considered a temporary vessel, a temptation, a trap. The real goal? To rise above it, to kill off desire, to be pure, not just morally but physically. And this applied to everyone, eventually, not just monks and nuns. Marriage was permitted, but celibacy was preferred. Virginity wasn't just for saints anymore. It was the gold standard of human existence. Still, not everyone fit the mould. Married couples existed. Children were born. People had desires, whether they confessed them or not. So the church stepped in with a system. Confession, penance, forgiveness, for a price. Sinners had to list their impurities in agonizing detail. The questions weren't vague. Medieval confession manuals literally asked, did you kiss with lust? Did you touch her below the navel? Were you thinking of another during the act? It was a full-body audit, and it was taken seriously. Now here's the scholarly debate. Did early Christianity invent sexual repression, or did it just organize it more efficiently than anyone before? Some argue that the Church merely adapted Roman moral codes to its theology. Others say it actively reshaped the Western psyche, embedding guilt, control, and bodily suspicion so deeply that we're still unpacking it centuries later. Either way, you can feel the shift. Sex is no longer just a social or legal issue, it's a spiritual battleground. But what about men? Oh, don't worry, they got their own set of purity hoops to jump through. Masturbation was labelled a sin. Homosexuality, once nuanced and debated in Greek society, was now condemned outright. Any deviation from the natural law of procreation was considered an affront to God. Pleasure for pleasure's sake, hellfire. The body wasn't just a problem, it was the enemy. And yet in secret the same contradictions crept in. Monks scribbled erotic poetry in the margins of prayer books. Nobles paid for indulgences while keeping mistresses. People found ways to cheat the system, even as they knelt for forgiveness. You start to see how sex didn't vanish under Christian rule, it just went underground, hidden behind cloisters, whispered in alleyways, confessed through tears and muttered Hail Marys. You pass through a cloister now where a young nun stares out the window, dreaming of the world beyond the convent walls. She gave up everything to follow God, but still she dreams of touch, of freedom, of something more than cold stone and veiled silence. Even here, in this fortress of chastity, desire hums under the surface. Quiet, dangerous, undeniable. By the time you step out into the open air again, you realise the world has changed. Sex isn't just criminal now, it's cosmic. Your choices echo in eternity. Your thoughts might condemn you. Your body is something to survive, not celebrate. And for women especially, virginity isn't just a virtue, it's the only protection against both social ruin and spiritual damnation. So as you blow out your candle tonight and lie still beneath your woolen blanket, remember, there was a time when saints were girls who bled for saying no, when holiness meant suppressing your body so fully, even dreaming was suspect, and when the highest form of love wasn't physical, it was untouchable. That's the legacy the church built, and it's going to stick around for a long time. You step out of the monastery, brushing the chill of stone off your shoulders, and the city around you glimmers, gold mosaics, incense smoke curling through the air, and priests in gleaming robes muttering in Greek. This is Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, where the Eastern Roman Empire has reinvented itself into something colder, stricter, and far more interested in what you do with your body when the curtains are drawn. You're not in pagan Rome anymore. You're in the realm of emperors who read theology like law books, where sin and sedition walk hand in hand. The Byzantines take what Rome started and crank it up to 11. Sex is still political, still regulated, but now it's draped in holy legitimacy. Not only is adultery a civic issue, it's a theological crime. Sex outside marriage, fornication, masturbation, a defilement, homosexuality, a vice punishable by exile or if you're lucky just a public flogging. And yes, there's a whole legal code for it. Emperor Justinian made sure of that. Here's your historical fact. Under Emperor Justinian I, in the 6th century, laws were passed that explicitly criminalised homosexual acts between men, described as unmentionable vice. And this wasn't just about morality. The text actually claimed that such behaviour would bring down divine wrath in the form of plagues and earthquakes. Literally. The logic was, if too many people sin, the empire gets punished. By God. With natural disasters. It wasn't just a personal failure, it was cosmic treason. And if that feels dramatic, well, it was. Justinian was building a vision of empire as heaven's mirror on earth. Every action, even in your bedroom, reflected your worth as a citizen of this divine kingdom. If you sinned privately, it wasn't private, it stained the soul of the state. So yeah, suddenly your sex life is a matter of national security. You walk through a public square noticing the women. Most are veiled, tucked away in homes, excluded from legal rights outside of marriage or religious orders. But there's one story that shines like a crack in the facade. You see her in a flash of silk and confidence, Theodora. Before she became empress, she was an actress, dancer, and possibly a sex worker. She was the kind of woman Byzantine law books were written against. And yet, she married Justinian himself. Here's your quirky fact. Theodora is said to have given speeches in her youth mocking the men who moralised about her body, while secretly enjoying it behind closed doors. Later, as empress, she pushed for laws protecting women from sexual violence and exploitation, reforms unheard of at the time. The irony, A woman who rose from the very world the empire demonized became its most powerful moral reformer. But don't be fooled. Theodora was the exception, not the rule. Most women, especially those caught outside the lines of marriage or virginity, faced harsh penalties. Byzantine law punished rape with castration or exile, but also punished women for seduction, even if they were the victims. It was complicated, patriarchal, and constantly shifting under the weight of religious influence. Now, about marriage. It was not exactly the stuff of romance. You didn't marry for love. You married for alliances, inheritance, social rank, and once inside it, your body was your spouse's property. Adultery laws punished women far more severely than men. A husband could cheat with a slave or prostitute without legal issue. A wife caught even talking flirtatiously with another man risked being shamed, exiled, or worse. Here's the scholarly debate. Was the Byzantine Empire truly harsher on sex than its Roman predecessor, or just more explicit about its moral goals? Some historians argue that Byzantine rulers, especially the more religious ones, believed they had a divine duty to legislate morality. Others claim these laws were more symbolic than enforced, designed to scare rather than punish. Either way, the result was the same. A tightening of the leash on human desire. You wander now into a small church. The icons stare down at you, silent, watchful. You can almost feel the weight of centuries of judgment in their painted eyes. And yet, in the margins, you find something surprising. Hidden in the texts, the poetry, the confessions, people still wrote about love, longing, secret kisses, forbidden touches. Even in this world of strict codes and heavy saints, humans remained human. There's a lesser-known manuscript written in Greek that includes a story of a monk and a novice who fell in love. The text never names them. It's not clear if it's autobiographical, fictional, or symbolic. But it lingers in the language, soft glances, emotional connection, regret. Not condemnation, but complexity. A reminder that beneath all the legislation, real people were still trying to figure out how to live with the contradictions of faith and flesh. And that brings you to another contradiction. While the empire publicly condemned homosexuality, eunuchs, castrated men, were frequently employed in high court positions, in harems, and even in the imperial palace. They were considered safe to be around women, trustworthy, neutral. But their lives were far from easy. Many were castrated as boys, often without consent, and their identities existed outside of any accepted category. Not men, not women, not free, not fully enslaved. It was a life on the margins, technically legal, practically tragic. Still, there were times when the empire tried to ease up. Certain rulers, like Emperor Basil I, tried to downplay the more punitive laws. Others doubled down, adding more punishments and intensifying surveillance. It all depended on who was in charge, and how nervous they were that God might send another earthquake. You leave Constantinople with the echo of church bells in your ears. The empire is beautiful, gilded, frightening, and deeply obsessed with keeping sex in its box, preferably nailed shut and buried under several layers of theology. Theodora might have slipped through, but most people, they learned to keep quiet, keep clean, or at least keep their sins well hidden. As you step out of the city gates into the dusk, you understand something new. This isn't just about laws anymore. It's about salvation, about the idea that your body could betray your soul, that something as ordinary as desire could bring down a city, or save it, depending on who wrote the sermon. And somehow, in the middle of all that fear and holiness, people still found each other, still whispered in corridors, still loved in whatever ways they could. You step out of the Byzantine shadows and into the sun-scorched streets of a desert city. The call to prayer echoes across sandstone rooftops, merchants haggle in narrow alleys, and date palms rustle like quiet applause. You've arrived in the early centuries of the Islamic world, Medina, Damascus, maybe Baghdad, where religion is young, laws are forming fast, and yes, sex is still a heavily surveilled territory. But here, something feels different. This isn't just shame and silence, it's also scripture, science, and a surprising amount of specificity. Islamic law, or Sharia, begins to crystallize in the 7th century, and unlike the vague moral codes of earlier societies, it gets very precise, very quickly. Marital rights, sexual obligations, boundaries, loopholes, it's all written down, and suddenly, Everyone from caliphs to camel herders knows exactly what is allowed in the bedroom and what might get you stoned in the street. Let's start with the heavy stuff. Here's your historical fact. Under classical Islamic law, adultery, called zina, was one of the most serious crimes you could commit. But proving it? That was almost comically difficult. The law required 4 adult male Muslim witnesses, all of whom had to personally see the act of penetration with clarity. No, really. That specific. No shadows, no assumptions, just full undeniable view. Needless to say, convictions were rare, if the rules were followed. But in practice, the burden of proof could get blurry. Women accused of zina sometimes found themselves punished with little more than rumour or pregnancy as evidence, and if they couldn't produce witnesses to defend themselves, things got brutal. Flogging, stoning, ostracisation. Legal theory may have tried to protect the accused, but human bias made its own rules. Still, there's more nuance here than you might expect. For example, within marriage, sex isn't just tolerated, it's considered a right. Both husband and wife are expected to fulfill each other's needs. It's even recorded in hadiths, sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, that a man who ignores his wife's sexual needs is acting unjustly. Consent, at least in theory, goes both ways. And that's miles ahead of many pre-modern legal systems. Here's your quirky fact. Early Islamic scholars weren't shy about sex, not even a little. The medieval Islamic world produced entire manuals on eroticism, detailed, poetic and graphic. Think The Perfumed Garden, or The Encyclopedia of Pleasure. These weren't fringe scrolls hidden in a backroom, they were popular literature. Scholars like al-Nafsawi or al-Suyuti wrote about positions, techniques, aphrodisiacs and romantic etiquette with zero shame. Sex was part of life, and if you were going to do it, better to do it right, spiritually and mechanically. And yet, even with all this openness, there were rigid lines. Homosexuality, while more fluidly understood in certain poetic and philosophical circles, was criminalised under religious law. Again, the requirement of 4 witnesses made actual convictions rare, but the social risk remained high. That didn't stop people from writing reams of poetry about beautiful young men, or from carving out spaces for quiet relationships. But it did mean those relationships often came wrapped in danger. Now here's the scholarly debate. Did Islamic societies historically enforce these sexual laws with strict consistency, or was there more flexibility than modern interpretations suggest? Some historians argue that medieval Islamic courts were surprisingly lenient, especially when it came to private behaviour. Others say the severity depended heavily on the ruler, the region, and the local customs. In places like Ottoman Istanbul or Abbasid Baghdad, enforcement could be more theatrical than functional, designed to scare people straight rather than drag them to court. You walk past a madrasa now, a school where students debate philosophy and law. They're reading Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, maybe even Aristotle. The scholars here don't treat sexuality as taboo, but as a thing to be examined, balanced, placed within the grand system of ethics and society. It's an intellectual exercise, but also a deeply human one. That's the paradox of this world. It intellectualizes desire, but it also boxes it in. And for women, those boxes were especially tight. Modesty laws, marriage contracts, and guardianship structures limited their ability to choose freely. A woman could initiate divorce in some regions under certain conditions, but social fallout could be severe. And if she was accused of unchastity, her options shrank fast. Still, some women found ways to maneuver. Wealthy widows ran businesses. Poets like Walada bint al-Mustakfi wrote unapologetically erotic verse. There were always cracks in the wall. You pass through a bustling market and into a quieter neighbourhood, where a young couple exchanges glances through a carved wooden screen. It's a game of risk and ritual. Public contact is limited. Private emotion burns hotter because it's repressed. Letters are slipped into baskets. Messages hidden in embroidered cloth. Love is strategized like a war campaign. Meanwhile, the wealthy elite take things in a different direction. The caliphs of the Abbasid court surround themselves with musicians, dancers and poets, both male and female. Some of these entertainers become lovers, others confidants. The line between sensuality and court culture is blurred, and once again, you see that power changes everything. A poor person gets stoned for adultery. A prince gets a love poem and a quiet pardon. You reach the edge of the city now, where mystics gather around a fire. Sufis, the spiritual seekers of Islam, see love, divine or human, as a path to enlightenment. Their poetry drips with longing, sometimes indistinguishable from erotic verse. Is it about God, or a lover, or both? Rumi, Hafiz, Ibn Arabi all describe love as a flame that burns away the self. And in that flame, sex becomes metaphor, yearning becomes worship. It's a strange fusion, discipline and desire, chastity and chaos, side by side in the same verse. And that's what you take with you as you leave this world behind. Islam didn't banish sex, it tried to regulate it, honour it, protect it, and control it all at once. Some succeeded, others suffered, and between the lines of scripture and law, millions of ordinary people lived their messy, beautiful, forbidden lives. So tonight, as the moon rises over minarets and silence settles in desert air, remember this. Even under the weight of law, literature and religion, people still found ways to desire. They wrote it, hid it, fought for it, and sometimes they just ignored the rules entirely. You wake to the scent of wood smoke and damp wool. The roads are muddier now, the streets narrower, the air thick with the scent of livestock and chimney soot. Welcome to medieval Europe, where the church isn't just in your village, it is the village. It's in your bed, in your thoughts, and definitely in your confessions. Sex hasn't disappeared. It's just been wrapped in chains of ritual, law, and endless guilt. You're about to step into the confessional booth, but be warned. The questions are about to get specific. You duck your head under the low beams of a parish church. It's quiet except for the whisper of prayers and the rhythmic shuffle of peasants crossing themselves. A priest sits waiting behind the screen, and when you kneel and whisper that you've had impure thoughts, he doesn't just nod solemnly. He pulls out a manual. A big one. The Medieval Confessor's Handbook, an actual instruction book used by clergy, is basically a catalogue of every sexual sin imaginable, and many you probably wouldn't imagine unless prompted. It's not vague. It's disturbingly thorough. Here's your historical fact. Confession manuals in the Middle Ages included detailed questions like, did you fondle with lust? Did you copulate in daylight? Did you spill seed on purpose? And yes, it was the priest's job to ask every single one. These guides were meant to ensure that no sin, no matter how small or deeply buried, slipped through the cracks of salvation. If you were thinking it, feeling it, or dreaming it, you'd better say it. But here's the thing. This wasn't all about purity. It was about control. The church didn't just want to save your soul. It wanted a full report. Your sexual life was a map, and every deviation was a checkpoint on the road to repentance. You could almost picture the scrolls behind the altar, tallying who had done what, how often, and with whom. And then there were the punishments. A little too handsy in the barn. Penance might mean fasting for 40 days, barefoot pilgrimages, or public acts of shame. Priests were instructed to assign harsher punishments if the act involved pleasure without the possibility of procreation. So yes, if you were having fun and being careful, that was twice the sin. Here's your quirky fact. Some confession manuals even included penalties for having sex completely clothed, because it implied immoderate haste and lack of dignity. You weren't supposed to enjoy it. You were supposed to perform it, like a grim marital tax. Anything resembling enthusiasm was automatically suspicious. Still, people didn't stop being people. They fell in love. They snuck off behind barns. They whispered in fields and lingered too long in doorways. And the church knew this. Which is why they built an entire infrastructure of surveillance and suspicion. That's how penance culture bloomed. Make everyone feel like they're already guilty, and they'll keep coming back for forgiveness. It was spiritual capitalism, and sin was the product. Now here's the scholarly debate. Was the medieval church genuinely interested in the inner workings of people's sex lives, or were these manuals more symbolic? Ideal blueprints that few priests actually followed to the letter? Some historians argue that most local clergy weren't especially zealous about enforcing the fine print. Others believe these manuals shaped a deep generational shame that bled into European identity for centuries. The truth probably lies somewhere between. Not every priest grilled their flock like a divine FBI agent, but the idea that someone could was enough to keep most people obedient. And then there was marriage. Supposedly holy, but realistically more economic than romantic. A lot of marriages were arranged, often young, and largely transactional. The church made a big deal about marital fidelity, mostly for women. Men, particularly wealthy ones, had more leeway. Again. And within marriage, consent wasn't really a concept yet. A husband had rights to his wife's body. Denial could be considered a sin, and rape within marriage not legally recognised as a crime. But if you were caught outside of marriage, you might end up in a public humiliation ritual. Stocks, shaved heads, paraded through town with signs around your neck that read things like adulteress or fornicator. It was the original scarlet letter, minus the symbolism. It didn't matter if it was love, passion, or loneliness. If it broke the rules, it was deviant. And yet, there were always loopholes. If you were rich, you could pay for indulgences, basically spiritual coupons that reduced your punishment. Nobles often had affairs, sometimes openly, as long as the church was getting its cut. Priests supposedly celibate were known to keep concubines. Some towns even had priests' wives, unofficial, unacknowledged, but understood by everyone. You walk past a leper house now, where a woman accused of being too loose has been confined. Her crime. No actual disease, just rumours, whispered sin, and a powerful family that needed her out of the picture. For many women, sexuality wasn't just policed, it was weaponized. A husband could get rid of a troublesome wife by accusing her of adultery. A father could force his daughter into a convent to preserve the family's honour. The body wasn't just private, it was political property. Still, some resisted. Love letters survived. So did poems, hidden under mattress straw or inside psalm books. One nun famously wrote about her affair with a priest in erotic Latin verse, and got caught only because her writing was too good not to be passed around. Some people ran away, others lived double lives. The walls of the medieval world were thick but not impermeable. You look up at a cathedral now, towering over the village like a mountain of stone. It took generations to build. Entire lifetimes were spent laying bricks, carving saints, and raising bells. And inside that majestic shell is a world that both worships the divine and fears the flesh. It builds structures to touch the heavens, but insists that your body must remain earthbound, humble, hidden. And tonight, as the bells toll across cold, muddy fields, you curl under your coarse wool blanket and whisper a truth that everyone in this world already knows. Everyone sins. Everyone falls. Everyone dreams of something more. And for every whispered confession, there's an unspoken desire that never makes it to the booth. The village fades behind you, the chapel bells dimming into the mist, and now you're riding along a forest path. Stone castles in the distance, troubadours humming songs about tragic lovers, and a quiet but deeply awkward truth simmering just beneath all the pageantry. You've arrived in the courtly age of medieval Europe, where noble women wear towering headpieces, knights fight over silk handkerchiefs, and sex has become something complicated. Not criminal, necessarily, but definitely inconvenient. Especially if you're married, which inconveniently, most people of rank are by age 14. Here's the thing. Marriage in the Middle Ages, especially among the nobility, isn't about romance. It's not even about companionship. It's about land, titles, and bloodlines. You marry to consolidate wealth, forge alliances, and produce heirs. Whether you actually like the person you're married to, deeply irrelevant. Which is why people start getting creative. You find yourself at a castle feast, where a bard is crooning a song about unfulfilled love. Everyone's drunk, and half the room is staring into the middle distance like they too are married to someone chosen by their parents. That's where courtly love steps in. A social invention so bizarre and specific, it may be the classiest workaround for sexual frustration in history. Here's your historical fact. Courtly love was a literary and cultural phenomenon in the 12th and 13th centuries that idealised noble, non-physical romantic longing between a knight and a lady, usually someone else's wife. It was supposed to be chaste, unconsummated, and full of flowery letters, longing gazes, and carefully veiled poems about how one might perish from not being able to touch a particular elbow. It's the medieval version of emotional cheating, except everyone's in on it. Entire codes of conduct were developed around this stuff. A knight might swear eternal devotion to a lady he can never actually have, and she in turn might send him a token, a ribbon, a glove, a deeply suggestive smile at Mass. But if they actually slept together, that broke the spell. It stopped being noble and became scandal. And here's your quirky fact. One of the most influential writers of courtly love, Andreas Capellanus, wrote a kind of love manual in the 12th century called De Amore, which includes chapters like how to resist the pleas of a peasant woman, how to love none like women, and why clerics make better lovers. It's part satire, part guidebook, and all deeply awkward. One of the rules: marriage is no excuse for not loving. Bold take, Andy. Now here's the problem. While these elaborate rituals played out in poems and parlours, real people had real desires and very real consequences when they acted on them. Adultery, especially for noble women, could mean imprisonment, annulment, or even execution. Kings sometimes looked the other way when it suited them, but other times, especially when succession or honour was at stake, heads rolled, literally. One famous case, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose marriage to Louis VII of France was annulled, possibly due in part to her outspokenness and rumoured affairs. She then married Henry II of England and spent the next few decades being alternately powerful, imprisoned, and very much involved in the politics and drama of her son's rebellions. Whether she was guilty of any actual infidelity remains debated, but the fact that her personal life was so publicly scrutinised tells you everything. And here's the scholarly debate. Was courtly love just harmless fantasy, or did it actually challenge the moral and legal norms of the time? Some argue it offered women more agency, at least in imagination, than the strict rules of marriage allowed. Others see it as a conservative pressure valve, a way to channel dissatisfaction into poetry instead of rebellion. Either way, it didn't change the rules. It just gave people something to whisper about at dinner. Meanwhile, in the peasant world, things were both simpler and crueler. Peasant marriages were less about politics and more about survival. Sex before marriage was technically a sin, but often tolerated if it ended in a wedding. In fact, bundling was a practice in some regions, where young couples would be allowed to sleep in the same bed, fully clothed, sometimes with a board between them, as a kind of test drive. What could possibly go wrong? But get caught fooling around with someone else's spouse. That still meant public shaming, stocks, fines, beatings, and for women, especially unmarried ones who got pregnant, the stakes were enormous. Bastardy laws made sure illegitimate children had no claim to inheritance, and the mother could be driven from the village. Some ended up in convents, others disappeared. Then there's the church, always watching, always whispering. Even while troubadours were singing odes to forbidden longing, priests were still reading from the same confession manuals, still warning that lustful thoughts could rot your soul, still insisting that sex within marriage was acceptable only if it was for procreation. Too much enthusiasm? Still a sin. And yet the contradictions were everywhere. A knight would go from swearing chaste devotion to a duchess at breakfast, to visiting a brothel by sunset. Nobles kept mistresses, clergy broke their vows, and everyone pretended not to notice, as long as it didn't get too loud or produce any problematic airs. You pass by a cloister where a nun writes poetry by candlelight, penning verses not about God, but about a mysterious lover who haunts her dreams. She will never say his name, never act on the impulse. But the longing burns through the ink. Courtly love has entered the monastery, and as you leave the castle grounds, the line between love, lust and loyalty only gets blurrier. You realise that in this strange, emotionally constipated society, people invented a whole new category of sin, wanting without touching. And somehow, that was even more dangerous than the touching itself. So tonight, as you lie under a woolen coverlet in a draughty stone keep, surrounded by cold walls and whispered oaths, you know this much. Even in a world where sex could get you killed, people still fell in love, still wrote poems, still risked everything for a glance, and sometimes they broke the rules. Quietly, elegantly, and with devastating consequences. Morning breaks with the scent of smoke and ash. The warmth of courtly flirtations is gone, replaced by something colder, darker. You're now in early modern Europe, somewhere between the 15th and 17th centuries, and the wind carries more than just the chill. It carries whispers, accusations, names, the kind that end up nailed to church doors or screamed from behind locked shutters. Because now, S3X isn't just dangerous, it's demonic, and if you're a woman, it might get you burned alive. Welcome to the era of the witch trials, where female sexuality isn't just sinful, it's suspect. And if it doesn't stay hidden, it's heresy. You're in a small village, let's say Germany or Scotland or France, because it really doesn't matter. This happened everywhere. The local priest preaches about sin and virtue, about obedience and God's wrath. But the real attention is on Margarita, or Elspeth, or Marie. She's a midwife, a widow. Maybe just a little too confident or unmarried, or rumoured to have seduced the blacksmith. That's all it takes. Here's your historical fact. During Europe's witch-hunting period, roughly 1450 to 1750, tens of thousands of people, the vast majority women, were accused of witchcraft. Many of them were charged not just with casting spells or dancing under the moon, but with engaging in carnal acts with the devil. Literally. The demon sex angle wasn't fringe, it was central to the panic. The manual said so. Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous 1487 witch-hunting guide written by two Dominican inquisitors, devoted entire chapters to the sexual behaviours of so-called witches. It claimed that women were more susceptible to demonic temptation because they were weaker in faith and more carnal by nature. In other words, if a woman wanted sex too much, or simply enjoyed it, that alone could be evidence she was in league with Satan. Now here's your quirky fact. Some witches were accused of stealing penises. Yes, entire genitalia, magically detached and stored in boxes. One inquisitor claimed witches kept them like pets and fed them oats. This wasn't satire. It was treated as legitimate courtroom testimony. Welcome to the absolute fever dream of sexual paranoia. You might think this was all rural superstition, but no. Judges, clergy, educated men, they were the ones writing the charges, building the torture devices, authorising the executions, and torture was standard procedure. If you were accused, you'd be stretched, crushed or burned until you confessed, often to acts you'd never even imagined before the interrogation spelled them out. Did you lie with the devil? They'd ask. Did he take the form of a man, an animal? Was it pleasurable? You say no. They turn the wheel. You say yes. They burn you anyway. But here's the deeper terror. This wasn't really about Satan. It was about control. About fear of the female body, especially bodies that weren't controlled by men. Unmarried women, widows, herbalists, midwives, or just those who spoke too loudly or lived alone. In an age where religious and political institutions were deeply male, independent women became walking red flags, and sex, that was the gateway drug to heresy. There's a scholarly debate here. Were witch trials truly about belief in magic, or just an excuse to discipline non-conforming women? Some historians lean toward mass hysteria fueled by religious extremism. Others point to economic pressures. Many witches owned land or had some form of financial independence. Accusing them wasn't just moral panic, it was profitable. Either way, the pattern is hard to ignore. Sexual suspicion led to violence, again and again. Meanwhile, in the cities, early modern Europe wasn't exactly less repressive, just more bureaucratic about it. Prostitution was still criminalised, but tolerated in designated red light districts. The church officially condemned it, of course, but everyone from soldiers to priests frequented brothels. As long as it was discreet, it was manageable. But if you were caught selling your body outside regulation, or worse, if you liked it, then you were the problem. One Parisian record details the arrest of a young woman who was accused of being wanton, not because of a client, but because she was seen laughing with men in public. That was enough. She was arrested, whipped, and paraded through the streets. The goal wasn't just to punish, it was to humiliate. And let's not forget the rise of syphilis during this period, a disease that became a moral event as much as a medical one. Instead of treating it as a health crisis, governments treated it like divine punishment. Brothels were raided, sex workers blamed, and laws passed to surveil unruly women. Men, of course, suffered too, but rarely got shamed the same way. The disease was called the French pox in England, the Italian disease in France, and basically every country blamed someone else. But no one blamed their own hypocrisy. You walk through a town square where a pillory stands waiting. A wooden board, a few iron cuffs, a reminder. Maybe yesterday it held a man who'd been caught with a priest's wife, or a woman who wore too much colour, too much perfume. You hear the stories. People fined for kissing in public, for having sex on a Sunday, for dancing too closely. It wasn't about morality anymore. It was about performance, keeping up appearances, making sure your neighbour sees you kneel in church, even if you were in someone else's bed the night before. And yet, despite it all, people still found ways to love and lust. Lovers met in barns, behind alehouses, in secret gardens. Hidden letters passed under doors, illicit poems inked with desperation. Even the records, cold and bureaucratic, sometimes betray a hint of humanity. A note in the margin, a smile in a witness's account, a laugh that slipped through the courtroom. So as night falls over the damp cobblestones and smoke curls from the chimneys, you lie awake knowing this. In early modern Europe, sex wasn't just sinful. It was suspicious, powerful, punishable, but it was also human, and no amount of fire, fear, or ritual could fully snuff it out. Not even the devil could keep track of it all. You're stepping through a massive red gate now, wide enough for imperial processions and high enough to scrape the fog. The air is thick with incense and bureaucracy. This is China during the imperial dynasties, a world where etiquette is so finely tuned that even how you lower your eyes is a performance. And beneath all that control, all those Confucian ideals and silken layers, lies a dark contradiction. A society terrified of unregulated sex and yet utterly obsessed with managing every aspect of it. If you're looking for intimacy, you'd better check in with the Emperor first. At the heart of this system is the Forbidden City, grand, symmetrical, and full of secrets. You're walking its corridors now, and you hear nothing but your own footsteps on polished stone. Why? Because most of the people who work here aren't allowed to speak, and many of them aren't even considered fully male anymore. Welcome to the world of the eunuchs. Here's your historical fact. For over 1,000 years, Chinese emperors relied heavily on eunuchs, men who had been castrated, usually as children, to serve in the inner palace. They managed everything from the imperial kitchens to the emperor's bedroom schedule. Because they were considered safe around the many women of the palace, eunuchs were given access denied to almost every other man in the empire. But here's the cruel irony. These trusted servants were also despised, ridiculed, and frequently accused of corruption and sexual deviance. They were stripped of their manhood and yet expected to police the sexuality of others, especially the emperor's concubines. If a concubine was found pregnant without imperial approval, someone's head, or both of them, was going to roll. Here's your quirky fact. Eunuchs weren't always fully compliant with their enforced celibacy. Some paid to have fake testicles made out of bamboo or gold, worn under their robes to restore a sense of masculinity. Others found lovers among fellow eunuchs, or even with palace maids, risking torture if caught. One eunuch memoir describes elaborate secret rendezvous in laundry rooms and behind garden walls, all under the noses of palace guards. Still, their lives were grueling. The castration process was painful, often fatal, and offered no guarantee of advancement. But for some poor families, selling a son into the palace was a way out of poverty. It was both a sacrifice and a strategy, a brutal exchange of flesh for status. And what about the women? The emperor's harem could include hundreds of concubines, each carefully ranked and controlled. Their lives were luxurious but tightly regulated. Access to the emperor was scheduled down to the hour, with elaborate rituals to confirm that any resulting child was indeed legitimate. A concubine who fell out of favour might live out her days in loneliness, surrounded by gold and silence. One who got too close to someone else disappeared. Now here's the scholarly debate. Were eunuchs a stabilising force in the imperial court, or did their presence introduce constant political chaos? Some historians argue that eunuchs, cut off from traditional family ties, were ideal bureaucrats, loyal only to the emperor. Others say their unique position allowed them to accumulate massive unchecked power, leading to corruption, manipulation, and coups. Either way, their role was inextricably linked to controlling access, to power, to the throne, and to sex. Outside the palace, things weren't exactly free and easy either. Confucianism, deeply embedded in Chinese society, emphasized chastity, obedience, and family order. Women were expected to be virgins before marriage and loyal afterward. Loyal, even in widowhood. Some widows were praised for committing suicide rather than remarry. Virtuous woman wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. You pass a village shrine now, where wooden tablets list the names of women who died to protect their virtue. In some provinces, entire temples were built to honour chaste widows and girls who took their own lives to avoid dishonour. There were awards, ceremonies, stories turned into moral lessons. The message was clear. Sex, outside its designated bounds, wasn't just shameful, it was life-ending. And yet, desire lived on, in poetry, in secret affairs, in art so erotic it had to be rolled up and hidden away. The Chinese produced their own versions of pillow books, manuals and paintings depicting sex acts with breathtaking detail. These were often as educational as they were titillating, and not just for men. One Tang Dynasty guidebook was written for newlywed women, explaining how to balance duty and pleasure with elegance and silence. In urban brothels, especially in cities like Suzhou and Hangzhou, courtesans were both performers and lovers. Trained in poetry, music and dance, they catered to the elite, offering not just sex but conversation and companionship. A scholar might fall madly in love with a courtesan, pen her sonnets, and still be unable to marry her. They were adored in private, discarded in public. Still, for many, these relationships were more meaningful than arranged marriages ever allowed. And then there were the punishments. Adultery could result in public beating, imprisonment, or death, especially for women. A woman caught with a lover might be executed, while the man faced fines or exile. Again, double standards ran deep. A husband could have concubines, but a wife. One misstep and she was done. You walk through a scholar's study now where painted scrolls hang beside shelves of philosophy texts. In one, a woman and a man lie tangled together, beautifully rendered in ink and colour. It's erotic, but also serene. No shame, just connection. And that's the contradiction you keep seeing. China's official culture was rigid, punitive, obsessed with order. But its underground culture, tender, curious, even celebratory of desire. You hear it in the poetry of Li Bai and Du Fu. You see it in the folds of silk robes, in the glance shared between lovers during a festival, in the rituals of tea and the stolen moments between arranged obligations. As the night falls and lanterns flicker on balconies, you understand something important. For all the restrictions, the inspections, the body policing and institutional cruelty, people still found ways to love. They paid for it, hid it, fought for it, but it didn't disappear. So tonight, beneath the curved eaves of a silent palace and the watchful gaze of a eunuch who's seen too much to care, you fall asleep knowing this. Empires can silence, sterilize and punish, but they can't extinguish desire. Not really. Now you're drifting east across the sea, and the air sharpens into something clean, pine-scented, and quietly refined. Welcome to Japan, somewhere between the Heian and Edo periods, where poetry replaces pillow talk, desire is folded into ceremony, and every movement, every glance, every whispered phrase carries centuries of ritual. You walk through a bamboo grove and into a society where sex is not always hidden, but it's rarely named. It's everywhere and nowhere, spoken and unspoken. And if you're not paying attention, you'll miss the most scandalous things entirely. You're in Kyoto first, during the Heian era. The nobility here write love poems on silk fans, their hair brushed to the floor, their speech veiled in metaphor. Courting someone isn't about bold declarations. It's about leaving the right scent on your letter, choosing the perfect season to deliver it, and waiting 3 days to respond just to appear appropriately conflicted. Sex happens, yes, but it's cloaked in layers of etiquette and nighttime visits called yobai, literally night crawling. You slip through the house, climb into her bed, and if she's still there in the morning, congratulations, you're now sort of a couple. Here's your historical fact. Yobai was a common custom for centuries in Japan, where men would stealthily visit women in their homes at night, sometimes with the family's tacit approval. If things went well and no scandal erupted, a marriage might follow. But if it didn't, the woman could be labelled as damaged, while the man walked away untouched, both physically and socially. Still, the Heian court had its own twisted freedom. Affairs were common. Marriages were often political and non-exclusive. Women could own property, write literature, and shape court life. The tale of Genji, written by a noblewoman named Murasaki Shikibu in the 11th century, is widely considered the world's first novel. And it's mostly about who sleeps with whom, and how messy that becomes. It's delicate, but deeply juicy. But then centuries pass and things shift. Now you're in the Edo period. The shoguns rule, samurai roam the streets, and Japan's famously rigid class system locks people into social cages. And with those cages comes a new kind of surveillance. Less poetry, more paperwork. Sex isn't just something to whisper about now, it's officially mapped out, contained and taxed. Enter the yukaku, the licensed pleasure quarters. Most famously, Yoshiwara in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, a floating world of courtesans, tea houses and lantern-lit nights. This isn't hidden, it's institutionalized. These districts were walled, guarded, and operated under strict rules. You couldn't just wander in. You were inspected, logged, and expected to behave with a certain blend of decorum and desperation. Here's your quirky fact. High-ranking courtesans known as oiran were so stylized and unattainable that sleeping with one required weeks of gifts, poetry, rituals, and endless spending. It wasn't just sex, it was performance art. The irony, by the time most clients could afford her, they were too broke or drunk to actually enjoy it. Meanwhile, lower-ranking workers had no such barriers. Many entered the profession young, some by choice, many by necessity or coercion. Despite the elegance in the advertising, their lives were often brutal. Long hours, limited mobility, and the constant threat of debt, disease, or violence. Brothels kept tight control, and though some women escaped or earned their freedom, most did not. The glamour of the floating world was painted in watercolour, but underneath was exhaustion, exploitation, and silence. There's a scholarly debate here. Were these pleasure districts exploitative prisons, or unique cultural spaces where women wielded rare influence? Some argue that courtesans had more agency than most women of their time, selecting clients, setting prices, dictating terms. Others call that romantic revisionism, pointing to the economic structures that left women with few real choices. The truth, as usual, floats in between. And what about same-sex desire, surprisingly visible? Among samurai male-male relationships, particularly between older warriors and their adolescent companions, were not only common, but ritualized. The practice was called wakashudo, or the way of the youth, and included mentorship, affection, and often sexual intimacy. It was considered a normal part of a warrior's life, provided it didn't interfere with loyalty or social duty. You read poems from that time, men writing to men, women to women, and while some are coded, many are shockingly open. In certain Buddhist monasteries, same-sex relationships were quietly accepted, even joked about. Japan, unlike much of the West, didn't attach a moral panic to these desires, at least not until modern influences brought in foreign shame. But of course shame did exist, just differently. For women, especially outside the pleasure quarters, chastity was still expected. Adultery, if discovered, could lead to public shaming, beatings, or even execution, particularly if it disrupted the social order. A peasant woman caught with a samurai? Dangerous. A merchant's wife found pregnant by her servant? Scandalous. Punishment didn't always fall equally, but the message was clear. Know your place, and stay in it. Still, sex bled into every aspect of life. Erotic art known as shunga was wildly popular. Beautiful woodblock prints depicting couples, and sometimes threesomes, sometimes ghosts, sometimes animals, long story, in explicit poses. They were collected like baseball cards, passed around in secret, and depending on the political mood, occasionally banned. But never for long. Even the shoguns had their stashes. You step into a small shop now, paper walls glowing in the afternoon light. A man purchases a book wrapped in brown paper. He bows politely, but when you glance at the spine, it's not philosophy, it's shunga. The quiet rebellion continues, and that's the paradox. Japan wrapped sex in formality, ceremony, and layers of metaphor, but it never erased it. Instead, it regulated and rebranded it, turning brothels into theatres, affairs into poetry, and intimacy into a performance of class and power. As you leave the red lantern-lit streets and wander into a silent garden, you feel that contradictions settle like mist on your skin. In this world, sex was both everywhere and nowhere, hidden yet printed on scrolls, policed yet performed, and through it all, desire bent itself to survive, folded, powdered, perfumed and masked, but never quite gone. So tonight, beneath a paper lantern and the hush of a distant shamisen, you sleep with the knowledge that even in a society obsessed with grace and control, people still found ways to touch each other, even when the rules said they shouldn't. Now the air changes again, heavier, dustier, shot through with the scent of heat and empire. You're standing in colonial India, and this place is already older than your imagination knows how to hold. Around you rise ancient temples carved with gods mid-embrace, statues that seem to move under your gaze, and poetry that doesn't blush. Here, for thousands of years, S3X has been part of the spiritual architecture. It's divine, it's sacred, it's a whole system of philosophy. But now, someone's knocking on the door with stiff collars, sideburns, and a suitcase full of shame. The British have arrived. You're in Varanasi first, watching the Ganges roll slow and holy under the sunrise. Nearby, a carved panel shows entwined bodies, sensual, peaceful, complex. You're not in the land of guilt anymore. You're in the home of the Kama Sutra. Not just a book, but a philosophy. A guide not just to sex positions, but to the art of living well. And to be clear, it wasn't written in some hidden corner of society. It came from elite circles, scholars, philosophers, people who thought pleasure was part of being human, not something to punish. Here's your historical fact. The Kama Sutra, written somewhere between the 3rd and 5th centuries CE by a man named Vatsyayana, was one of several Hindu treatises on love, sex and domestic life. It wasn't a sex manual in the modern sense, it was a guide to the ideal life. It placed karma, desire, alongside artha, material success, and dharma, duty, as one of the 3 pillars of existence. In this worldview, sex wasn't sinful. It was natural, essential, sacred, and it wasn't alone. Entire temples like those at Khajuraho or Konark were covered in erotic sculpture. Limbs tangled, hips lifted, expressions calm, focused, almost meditative. These weren't pornographic. They were celebratory. These images weren't hidden away in the corners of walls. They were right there, in the open, alongside deities and cosmic symbols. Sex wasn't a shameful whisper. It was an offering. But then, the East India Company, the British Crown, missionaries, civil servants with moustaches and pocket watches. They arrive, look around, and promptly have a cultural aneurysm. Here's your quirky fact. In the 19th century, British officials were so scandalised by India's erotic art that they began actively covering it up. In some cases, they built fences or hung curtains around sculptures. Victorian values simply couldn't cope with gods in mid-coitus. One missionary called the temples monuments to the utter degradation of a once noble people. Another claimed the Kama Sutra was a perverse document of animalism. That's the thing about colonialism. It doesn't just take your land, it tries to rewrite your values too. And so begins the moral crackdown. Laws imported from England criminalise obscenity and unnatural acts, code for basically any sexual behaviour that doesn't line up with stiff Victorian expectations. Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, passed in 1861, criminalised homosexuality as carnal intercourse against the order of nature. The language was vague on purpose. The punishment? Up to life in prison, a colonial ghost that would haunt India's legal system for more than 150 years. Now here's the scholarly debate. Did colonialism invent sexual repression in India, or did it simply amplify it? Some historians argue that Hinduism and other South Asian traditions were always more fluid and open about sex and gender. Others point out that caste structures, patriarchal norms, and strict codes of female chastity existed long before the British showed up. What colonialism did was institutionalise shame, wrap it in law, police it in schools, and moralise it in courtrooms. You walk now through a crowded bazaar full of noise, spices, music, and somewhere in the back, a man selling old books under the table. One is a worn copy of the Kama Sutra, its cover folded, the title discreet. Another is an Urdu language romance novel, serialised and cheaply printed, with more longing glances than actual kisses, but you get the picture. These books move fast because they are unofficial, banned sometimes, always watched. A quiet resistance. Meanwhile, women's bodies become the front line of cultural anxiety. On the one hand, the British paint Indian women as helpless, passive, in need of saving, often from their own traditions. On the other hand, they're also eroticised in Orientalist art, fetishised in fiction, consumed by foreign audiences under the guise of anthropology. The contradictions stack high, and the weight falls on women. Even within Indian society, the pressure intensifies. Female chastity becomes synonymous with national honour. Women are expected to be modest, silent, sacrificing. The erotic temples stay standing, but their meaning is lost behind glass and academic commentary. The sensual becomes scandal. Desire becomes defiance, but it doesn't go quietly. You walk through the home of a courtesan, tawif as they were called, trained in classical music, dance, poetry and conversation. These women were artists, educators. Some were lovers to nobles, yes, but they also hosted salons where political ideas were debated and songs composed. In pre-colonial India, tawaifs held social capital. Under British rule, they're reduced to prostitutes. discredited, disrespected, discarded. Still, resistance lives in the margins. Letters between lovers, secret performances, hidden scripts passed hand to hand. In Bengal, radical poets begin writing about sex again, not just as pleasure, but as political power. In Urdu ghazals, love and longing remain weapons against control. The erotic returns, not as decoration, but as rebellion. As you move toward the 20th century, independence movements take hold, but the moral codes don't disappear. The British may leave, but their legal shadows stay behind. Section 377 remains. Obscenity laws stay on the books, and for decades the country struggles with the gap between its past, fluid, expressive, sensuous, and its present, bureaucratic and nervous. But the memory lingers, in the temples, in the poetry, in the secret jokes passed down between generations. You hear it in the way someone speaks your name, just slightly softer, in the flash of a dancer's wrist, in the verse of a folk song that doesn't name what it wants but makes you feel it anyway. So tonight, as you lie under a whirring ceiling fan in a room full of heat and memory, remember this. For centuries, India treated desire as sacred. Then it was criminalised. But it never disappeared. It folded itself into shadow, waited out the empire, and now breathes again in every verse, every glance, every hand held a moment too long. Because shame may be imported, but longing is homegrown. You're standing in the middle of a Massachusetts village now, and the world feels beige, muted, like someone drained the colour out of life and replaced it with rules. Welcome to early colonial America, where the Puritans have landed, and they've brought with them a special brand of fear, God, and relentless sexual paranoia. These are the people who didn't just criminalise pleasure, they built whole stocks, scaffolds, and scarlet letters for it. If you so much as glance at someone the wrong way, prepare to be publicly shamed. Sex here isn't just private, it's a community project, and your neighbours are always watching. It's the 1600s, and you're walking past a meeting house, stiff wooden walls, gravel path, plain as bread dough. Inside, the preacher is thundering about temptation, sin, and hellfire. His eyes sweep the crowd like he's daring someone to flinch. His gaze lingers on a young woman in the back row. She's been seen talking to a farmhand after dark. No proof, just whispers. But in this world, whispers are currency. Here's your historical fact. Puritan communities in New England had laws punishing adultery, fornication, and even uncleanness between unmarried people, often enforced with public punishments. Stocks were common. So were fines, forced confessions, and public humiliation. Adulterers could be whipped, branded, or paraded through town wearing signs or, yes, literal scarlet letters sewn to their clothing. And no, Nathaniel Hawthorne didn't invent that detail. The Scarlet A was a real punishment. Historical court records from colonial Massachusetts describe women forced to wear symbols of their crime. Sometimes they were branded on the shoulder. Other times they stood in church with heads bowed while the entire congregation stared them down, silently confirming their new place at the bottom of the moral food chain. But let's not pretend this was evenly applied. While both men and women were technically subject to the same laws, the reality was different. Women bore the brunt of the shame, especially if they became pregnant. Unmarried and pregnant. There was your evidence. No courtroom needed. The father might disappear. She, meanwhile, would face exile, labour punishments, or a forced confession in front of the entire town. Here's your quirky fact. In some Puritan settlements, midwives were required to interrogate women in labour if they weren't married. In the middle of childbirth, yes, mid-contractions, questions like, who is the father, and when did this happen, were asked and recorded. The logic? A woman in pain couldn't lie. So why not use that pain for a little honest detective work? Meanwhile, back in the church, ministers loved to preach about the dangers of lust, especially in men, but they also blamed women for causing it. A flash of ankle, a ribbon tied too brightly, a laugh too loud. Suddenly she was the harlot of Babylon. The Eve made me do it argument remained popular, and Puritan sermons were filled with warnings about Jezebels, witches, and temptresses. And speaking of witches, remember what happened when a woman's behaviour seemed too ungoverned. Salem, 1692. Not entirely about sex, but tangled up with it. Many of the accused were older women, widows, or those who lived alone, women without male oversight. Some were accused of seducing men, bewitching them. One woman was said to have caused a man's uncontrollable bodily desires with a glance. She was hanged. He got a pass. There's a scholarly debate here. Did Puritans genuinely believe in the strict moral codes they enforced, or were these rules more about maintaining social control in a precarious, unfamiliar land? Some argue that these communities were simply trying to survive, using moral discipline as scaffolding. Others say it was a theocratic power grab, keeping people obedient by weaponizing shame. Either way, the result was the same. Your body wasn't your own. It belonged to the community, and the community had opinions. You pass a row of houses now, narrow and plain, where couples live in officially sanctioned, biblically blessed marriages. And yes, married people were allowed to have sex. In fact, they were expected to. If a husband refused his wife, or vice versa, it could be grounds for divorce. That part, progressive, in a twisted way. But it wasn't about pleasure. It was about duty, reproduction, social stability. And if you enjoyed it too much, that could be a problem. One case tells of a man fined for excessive familiarity with his wife in public. Excessive. With his wife. The court didn't specify what that meant, but apparently it involved smiling too much and possibly touching her back. Another case involved a woman accused of flirtatious behaviour for lingering too long in the tavern doorway. She denied everything, but the town decided it was a sign of moral rot. She was fined and warned. Next time she wouldn't be so lucky. But behind the stiff collars and cold pews, people still broke the rules. They wrote secret love letters. They met in the woods. They confessed sins they had every intention of repeating. Even some of the ministers weren't immune. More than one was caught with a servant, or worse, caught writing about desires he was supposedly praying away. And then there were the native peoples. The colonists judged them harshly for their more open attitudes about sex, especially around nudity and premarital relationships. Puritans saw indigenous cultures as immoral, savage, in need of spiritual discipline. In reality, many tribal societies had their own codes, complex, often gender-balanced, and in some cases far more respectful of female autonomy than the Puritan model. But the colonists weren't interested in understanding. They came to erase, not learn. As you walk past the meeting house one last time, you hear a baby crying inside. Born out of wedlock? Maybe. The village will know soon enough. They always do. So tonight, as you settle into a small wooden bed under a thatched roof and a sky full of judgment, you understand this. The Puritans didn't criminalize sex because they didn't have it. They criminalized it because they couldn't stop thinking about it. Obsession cloaked in righteousness. Repression sold as virtue. And under it all, in the shadows of stocks and scarlet cloth, people kept loving, kept lusting, kept sinning. Quietly, carefully, but relentlessly. You blink and suddenly everything smells like leather gloves, strong tea and unspoken hysteria. You're in Victorian England now, the 1800s, and everything around you looks like it's been polished, powdered, and politely repressed. The corsets are tight, the curtains are thicker, and the rules? So many rules. At first glance, you're in the land of manners and modesty, where ankles are controversial and the word leg is too racy to say at dinner. But dig just beneath the surface, pull back the lace and the forced smiles, and you'll find an entire culture quietly unravelling beneath the weight of its own sexual confusion. You stroll down a London street paved with horse dung and secrets. A gentleman tips his hat. A woman clutches her parasol. No one looks too long at anyone. But just around the corner is a discreet door leading to a private medical office, where a well-dressed woman lies on a fainting couch, while a doctor calmly applies a vibrating device to her pelvis. She's not sick. She's not injured. She's being treated for hysteria. Here's your historical fact. In Victorian medicine, female hysteria was considered a legitimate diagnosis, with symptoms including nervousness, irritability, fainting and, wait for it, sexual desire. The supposed cure? Pelvic massage. Yes. It was believed that women suffering from hysteria needed to be manually brought to orgasm, though no one actually used that word. Doctors called it paroxysm, which somehow made it sound medical enough to justify repeated visits. Eventually the process became so exhausting that doctors invented one of the first electromechanical vibrators just to speed things up. A medical tool, they said. Nothing to do with pleasure. Nothing to see here. Here's your quirky fact. Early advertisements for these devices were printed in women's magazines, right next to ads for corsets and soap. One 19th century catalogue offered the White Cross vibrator for nervous disorders, complete with woodcut illustrations and a note that it could be operated by hand or attached to a small motor. Very modern, very clinical, very, very British. Meanwhile, the rest of society was pretending sex didn't exist, or at least that it only existed behind closed bedroom doors in complete darkness, with precisely zero enthusiasm. Women were supposed to be the angel in the house, pure, passive, maternal. Any sign of passion, suspicious, vulgar, dangerous. And yet men were expected to be something else. The Victorian gentleman was supposed to be self-controlled in public but virile in private, and if his wife didn't perform, well, society quietly nodded as he went to a brothel. Because yes, those still existed. In fact, they thrived. In 19th century London, it's estimated there were over 5,000 brothels and tens of thousands of sex workers. Public morality preached abstinence, private behaviour paid by the hour. You walk past a row of terraced houses now, one of them likely a discreet establishment. Inside, young women sit in parlours dressed like fine ladies, trained to play piano, make small talk, and offer more than just conversation. They are judged constantly, by age, appearance, even race, and often managed by older women called madams, some of whom had once been in the trade themselves. These women live in a strange paradox, condemned by society but necessary to it, legislated but never protected. Victorian authorities regularly passed Contagious Diseases Acts that allowed police to forcibly examine women suspected of prostitution for venereal disease. No warrant, no trial, just suspicion. If found infected, they could be confined in a lock hospital for months. Men, of course, were not subject to these rules, because hypocrisy was half the culture. There's a scholarly debate here. Were Victorian women really as repressed as their reputation suggests? Or were they simply navigating a deeply contradictory world? Some argue that the era offered women unprecedented social influence, especially through literature, reform, and education. Others say that any form of power a woman had still depended on appearing chaste, modest, and sexually invisible. Female desire didn't disappear, it just had to dress up as something else. Even literature got tangled in the mess. Authors like Thomas Hardy, George Eliot, and the Bronte sisters wrote about passion. But it always came with consequences. Want the man too much, he dies, gets seduced, you get pregnant and tossed into poverty. Even the most scandalous female characters, like Anna Karenina and Madame Bovary, wrong continent, same repression, end up dead. The message was clear. Desire kills women, or at least it should. And what about homosexuality? Well, it officially didn't exist. Until it did, loudly, scandalously, and tragically. The case of Oscar Wilde is the most infamous. A celebrated playwright and wit, Wilde was tried in 1895 for gross indecency after his relationship with a younger man was exposed. The trial wasn't just about law. It was a public spectacle of moral outrage. Wilde was convicted and sentenced to 2 years of hard labour. It broke him. He died not long after his release, impoverished and exiled. Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act had made male homosexual acts illegal, even in private. Female homosexuality, not mentioned. Legend has it, Queen Victoria refused to believe such a thing could exist. Too absurd, she supposedly said. Too ridiculous. Whether the story is true or not, it perfectly captures the period's selective imagination. And yet, just like in every other time and place, people still found each other. Secret clubs, discreet letters, hidden apartments behind false bookcases, artists, poets, and lovers created whole underground worlds that pulsed beneath the polished floors of the Victorian parlour. Desire didn't vanish, it just wore gloves. You walk past a milliner's shop now where a woman sells hats by day and writes erotica by candlelight. Her stories are passed hand to hand, read by firelight, burned when the wrong person knocks on the door. No name, no address, just ink, paper, and a fierce private rebellion. So tonight, beneath the ticking of a grandfather clock and the stifling weight of velvet drapes, you lie awake with this thought. The Victorians didn't hide sex because they hated it. They hid it because they feared it, because it cracked their porcelain illusions of order, because it made people unpredictable, uncontrollable, real. And yet, Even in the most tightly laced era of Western history, desire whispered through the cracks, and someone always listened. You open your eyes now in a cotton field. The sun beats down relentlessly, and the sound of insects buzzes through the thick, humid air. But there's something heavier than heat pressing on your chest. This is not just any plantation. This is the American South in the 18th and 19th centuries, where sex, slavery, and power are tangled into something brutal, dehumanizing, and systematic. This isn't just about criminalizing sex, it's about weaponizing it. In this world, some people don't even have legal ownership over their own bodies, let alone the right to say no. You're walking the rows now, passing enslaved people bent over crops, their backs bent under more than labour. Behind you, the plantation house looms white and still. Inside, the master dines. Outside, the system breathes, fed by violence and silence. Here's your historical fact. In slaveholding societies across the Americas, including the United States, enslaved people had no legal right to consent. That means rape wasn't recognized as a crime if the victim was enslaved. If a slaveholder, or an overseer, or even another enslaved person, committed sexual violence against an enslaved woman, the law said nothing. And in many cases, the law wasn't just silent, it was complicit. You see, enslaved women's reproduction was profitable. Their children were born into slavery, becoming new property, new labour, which meant that every pregnancy was money in someone else's pocket. The more children born, the more hands in the field. So sexual violence wasn't an accident of slavery, it was built in. Enslavers chose which couples could marry. Sometimes they bred people like livestock, selecting for size, strength, or fertility. And yet, despite all this, enslaved people still formed real bonds. They loved. They married in ceremonies not recognized by law, but deeply sacred to them. They built families under impossible conditions, even when those families could be torn apart and sold off at any moment. And here's your quirky fact, one that's hard to wrap your head around. Thomas Jefferson, 3rd President of the United States and author of All Men Are Created Equal, fathered multiple children with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman at Monticello. She was his legal property. Their relationship spanned decades. She was 14 when it began, and for years, American textbooks called it a mistress situation. It wasn't. She couldn't consent. She couldn't refuse. The word relationship collapses under that imbalance. But the abuse wasn't always shrouded in hypocrisy. Sometimes it was loud, sometimes it was punishment. An enslaved woman accused of being too uppity might be stripped, whipped, raped, and then forced to serve dinner to the very man who harmed her. The scars weren't just physical, they were generational. There's a scholarly debate here. How do we talk about enslaved women's sexuality without reducing them to victims? Some historians emphasize their agency, the ways they carved out space for pleasure, love, and even rebellion. Others focus on the overwhelming force of the system, arguing that any choice made under slavery can't truly be free. Both are true, and both deserve space. Men, too, were weaponized sexually. Though their abuse was less documented, it wasn't less real. Enslaved men were sometimes forced to have sex with women chosen by their owners, or they were humiliated, castrated, or assaulted in public as a way to break them. White anxieties about black male sexuality, especially around white women, fueled centuries of violence, both during and after slavery. The idea of the black brute was invented to justify lynching, segregation, and police violence long after the Civil War ended. You walk past a slave cabin now. It's small, dirt-floored, with a fire smouldering in the corner. Two people sit close together, their hands barely touching. Maybe it's the only time they've seen each other this week. Maybe they're married, at least as much as anyone here is allowed to be. They whisper soft words, speak names of future children. They know they may be sold tomorrow, but for now, this moment belongs to them. And what about laws? There were plenty, but they only protected white people. In some states, it was illegal for enslaved people to marry, illegal to testify in court, illegal to read or write. In others, laws existed only to maintain the fiction of racial superiority. If a white man raped a black woman, nothing happened. If a black man even looked at a white woman the wrong way, he could be killed. No trial, no questions. One particularly horrific case in 1855 involved Celia, an enslaved woman in Missouri who killed her owner after years of rape. She was pregnant by him, again, and had pleaded to be left alone. When he tried to assault her once more, she struck him with a stick and killed him. She was tried, convicted, and hanged. Her unborn child died with her. The court ruled that as an enslaved woman, she did not have the right to defend herself. Still, through all this, enslaved people resisted, sometimes with small acts, sneaking away at night to be with a partner, exchanging vows, carving names into wood, sometimes with larger ones, running away, sabotaging crops, fighting back. Love, under slavery, was rebellion. Pleasure, when it happened, was a kind of defiance. You walk now past a cemetery where simple stones mark nameless graves, but between those stones are stories of women who birthed children they weren't allowed to keep, of men who loved fiercely and lost everything, of couples who found each other in darkness, even when the world said they didn't belong to themselves. And then slavery ends, legally at least. But the shadow lingers. After emancipation, black women are still sexualized, criminalized, and ignored by the justice system. The Jezebel stereotype haunts them into the 20th century. Black men, meanwhile, are hunted for imagined threats to white womanhood. The violence continues, it just changes shape. So tonight, as you sit beneath a southern sky heavy with history, you understand something wrenching and real. In the world of slavery, sex wasn't criminalized in the usual sense. It was turned into a weapon, a tool of ownership, a system of control, and yet people still found a way to love, to connect, to assert their humanity in the face of dehumanization. Because even when everything is taken from you, the desire to be touched, gently, honestly, freely, does not die. The chains are rusted now, but the laws still bite. You're walking into the 19th and early 20th centuries, across Europe and the Americas, and the air smells like stale parchment and powdered wigs. The language has changed, but the obsession remains. Society is still fixated on controlling sex, only now it's cloaked in legalese. Welcome to the age of sodomy laws, vague, moralistic, and elastic enough to ruin lives without ever actually defining what crime was committed. It's less about acts and more about labels, less about justice and more about fear. You're in a courtroom first, marble, cold, echoing. A judge in robes stares down at a man in chains, accused of something called gross indecency. No one says what exactly happened. There are no specifics, just a nod, a whisper, a suspicion. He's guilty not because of what he did, but because of who he is. The court, like society, already made up its mind. Here's your historical fact. Sodomy laws were some of the oldest criminal statutes still enforced well into the 20th century. Rooted in religious tradition and colonial morality, these laws criminalized non-reproductive sex, most often between men, but the definitions were intentionally hazy. Sodomy could mean anything from anal sex to oral sex, and in some places it included acts between heterosexual couples. The ambiguity was the point. It allowed the law to accuse without having to prove, and the punishments? Brutal, imprisonment, hard labour, in some cases castration or death. In Britain, sodomy was a capital crime until 1861. In the United States, some states kept sodomy punishable by life in prison well into the 2000s. Yes, 2000s. That's not a typo. One of the most tragic stories? Oscar Wilde. Again, but this time, let's go deeper. He was convicted in 1895 under the UK's Criminal Law Amendment Act, specifically for gross indecency with other men. His crime wasn't a violent act, or even a public scandal. It was love letters. Private letters. And during his trial, the prosecution read them aloud, not to prove a point, but to humiliate him. He was sentenced to 2 years of hard labour, during which his health collapsed. He died penniless and broken, not because he was dangerous, but because he was different. Here's your quirky fact. In the United States, sodomy laws were enforced unevenly, and often used to police behaviour beyond just sexual acts. For example, in the 1950s, some people were arrested under sodomy statutes for merely dancing with someone of the same sex at a bar. Others were surveilled, harassed, or fired from their jobs because of rumours. It was less a law than a licence, to discriminate, to silence, to shame. This leads into the larger web: morality laws, obscenity statutes, anti-miscegenation laws. The legal system was flooded with ways to criminalise intimacy, especially when it crossed boundaries of gender, race, or class. In the American South, interracial relationships were criminal until the late 1960s. Defilement laws targeted adult men with younger women, under the guise of protecting virtue, but were unevenly applied depending on who had the better lawyer or skin colour. There's a scholarly debate here. Were sodomy laws really about public morality, or were they just a tool of social control? Spoiler, it's the latter. These laws weren't about keeping people safe. They were about keeping people in line. They policed identity, not just behaviour, and the ambiguity gave them incredible power, because when you don't define the crime, you can accuse anyone. You walk through a university campus now, in the 1920s. Bright students, jazz music, sexual awakening, but still, in the shadows, fear. Homosexuality is discussed in whispers. Some psychology professors write entire dissertations labelling it as a disease. Others try to defend it as harmless variation. The medical world can't decide, is it a disorder, a phase, a sin wrapped in science? Meanwhile, the law doesn't care. Arrests continue, surveillance intensifies, police raid bars and trap men in bathrooms, drag names through newspapers. One confession is enough to end a career, a family, a life. Even rumours are lethal. In Berlin, before the rise of the Nazis, there was a brief, extraordinary moment. The early 20th century saw Germany's queer community blossom in the open. Clubs, magazines, advocacy groups. Magnus Hirschfeld, a Jewish doctor and sexologist, founded the Institute for Sexual Research in 1919, where he studied and defended queer identities. He even advocated for the repeal of paragraph 175, the German law criminalising male homosexuality. But then, 1933, the Nazis come to power. Hirschfeld's institute is raided, his books burned. Paragraph 175 is not repealed, it's expanded. Tens of thousands of gay men are arrested. Many are sent to concentration camps where they wore pink triangles and were subjected to horrific abuse. Some were used in medical experiments, others were sterilised. Most never made it out. And after the war, the survivors weren't recognised as victims. Some were re-imprisoned. Their sentences were upheld. Their stories erased. You walk now through a dusty archive. You find letters between lovers who never got to say goodbye. Police records with names redacted, faces blurred. The law didn't just punish bodies, it erased love, it criminalised connection. But even in the shadows, people found each other. Secret codes, hidden rings, bars with nondescript names and locked doors. Ballroom culture emerged in American cities, safe spaces where queer people of colour built new families and danced in defiance. In Europe, underground networks helped queer men flee persecution. In prison cells, notes were passed, carved into walls, remembered in poems, and slowly cracks began to show. In 1957, the Wolfenden Report in the UK recommended decriminalising private homosexual acts between consenting adults. It took 10 more years to become law. In the US, the Stonewall riots of 1969 shattered the illusion of quiet tolerance. A generation stood up and said no more. Still, sodomy laws remained. In 1986, the US Supreme Court upheld Georgia's anti-sodomy law in Bowers v. Hardwick. The ruling stood for 17 more years. 17 years, until 2003, when Lawrence v. Texas finally struck down sodomy laws nationwide. By then, hundreds of people had been arrested, fired, evicted, all for nothing more than who they loved. So tonight, as you stand in a world of shadows slowly breaking into light, remember this. Sometimes, sex isn't criminalised because of what you do, but because of who you are. And the laws don't just punish pleasure, they punish difference. But even in the darkest corners of history, love kept breathing, quietly, fiercely, refusing to be erased. You hear a rattle of keys and the click of hard shoes on concrete. The air smells like damp paper and old fluorescent light. This is no ancient court or colonial council. You're in a 20th century police station, Chicago, maybe New York, maybe San Francisco. Doesn't matter, the script's the same. You're here not because you hurt someone, stole something, or set a building on fire. You're here because of fabric, specifically how you wore it. You've just been arrested for cross-dressing. And yes, that's an actual crime. Welcome to the era of gender panic, where sex is criminal if you do it with the wrong body, and gender is criminal if you wear the wrong clothes. You're not in ancient Babylon or medieval Europe. You're in 1955 America, and yet the fear of nonconformity is just as sharp, just as institutional, and just as absurd. Here's your historical fact. For most of the 20th century, it was illegal in many US cities to dress in clothing not belonging to one's sex. Police enforced so-called three-article laws, which required people to wear at least 3 items of clothing that matched the gender listed on their ID. If you didn't, that was enough for an arrest, a night in jail, or a fine, sometimes worse. These laws weren't always officially on the books. They were often buried in disorderly conduct statutes or vague morality codes. But they were enforced like clockwork. Trans women, drag performers, butch lesbians, and anyone who didn't fit into a neat little binary box got targeted. It wasn't about safety, it was about visibility. Step out of line, and the state made you pay. Here's your quirky fact. One of the most common defences used by people arrested for cross-dressing was that they were wearing underwear appropriate to their assigned gender. Imagine standing in a courtroom, lifting your skirt or unbuttoning your shirt just enough to prove you're wearing a specific type of underwear, because that was what might keep you out of jail. And the worst part, these arrests weren't just about the law, they were about public humiliation. Your name printed in the paper, your job lost, your family ashamed. The police didn't just take you in, they paraded you. Mugshots with wigs removed, makeup smeared, bodies exposed, a spectacle of enforced shame. You walk into a gay bar now, somewhere in the 1960s. The lights are dim, the music is just loud enough to hide the fear. This place isn't just a bar, it's a sanctuary. Somewhere to breathe, to dance, to be seen. But even here, you're not safe. Raids are frequent. Cops barge in, line everyone up, check IDs, lift skirts, grope bodies. Sometimes they arrest people. Sometimes they just humiliate them and leave. The bar owners pay bribes. The police take their cut and come back anyway. And the patrons, they come because there's nowhere else. There's no Tinder, no apps, no out and proud community centre. There's just this room. And the hope that maybe tonight the door stays closed, but it doesn't always. You're at the Stonewall Inn now. It's June 1969. The raid starts like all the others. Flashlights, barking cops, IDs slammed on counters, but this time, something shifts. People push back, boo, shout, then someone throws a brick, and suddenly the air is filled with rage and fire and something close to freedom. There's a scholarly debate here. Who threw the first brick? Was it Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, a nameless queen in heels and fury? We may never know for sure. But what we do know is that the people fighting back that night weren't Wall Street guys in secret. They were black and brown drag queens, trans women, homeless queer kids, hustlers, the ones the law had targeted for years, the ones who had nothing left to lose. And they fought. Stonewall wasn't the first queer uprising, but it became the spark. The reason we say Pride in June. The reason that even now every parade is part protest. But the laws didn't vanish. Not overnight. Even after Stonewall, cross-dressing laws lingered. Police still raided bars, people still got arrested. It would take decades of litigation, organising and public pressure to begin dismantling these codes of gender conformity. You pass through the 70s now, where queer and trans people organise harder. Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, STAR, founded by Johnson and Rivera, provides housing for homeless LGBTQ+ youth. Feminists clash over the place of trans women in their movements. Laws change slowly, unevenly, and always after struggle. In San Francisco, the Compton's cafeteria riot of 1966, a few years before Stonewall, was another flashpoint. Trans women, fed up with constant harassment and police brutality, fought back with sugar shakers and high heels. The police smashed windows, the Queen smashed right back. No one called it history then. But it was. You enter a courthouse in the 1980s. A trans woman stands trial, not for a crime, but for existing. She's trying to change the gender on her driver's license. The judge looks confused. The lawyers smirk. The clerks whisper. In some states, it's allowed. In others, it requires surgery, or a court order, or proof of psychological diagnosis, or nothing at all, or everything. There is no consistency, just hoops, always suspicion. And through it all, people keep living, loving, thriving. Trans women start collectives. Butch lesbians drive cross-country in pickup trucks, starting zines and networks. Drag queens throw benefit shows to pay each other's rent. Community isn't just a word, it's survival. Still, the legacy of criminalisation lingers. People lose jobs for how they dress. They're denied housing, denied medical care, denied safety. Some are killed. Their names barely make the news, but their faces line murals. Their stories echo in marches. Their resilience builds movements. And finally, in some places, the laws vanish. In 2011, New York repeals its walking while trans loitering law, long used to arrest women based on clothing alone. In 2020, the US Supreme Court rules that trans people are protected under federal employment law. In 2021, Spain makes it legal to self-identify your gender on ID. In 2022, Canada bans conversion therapy. Progress, but always contested. Always fragile. So tonight, as you sit in a room with the lights off, scrolling through headlines about anti-trans legislation being proposed yet again, you remember this. The crime was never the clothes, never the body, never the dance. The crime was the fear, the control, the attempt to define someone else's gender with a gavel and a badge. And still, people kept walking, in heels, in boots, in binders and lipstick and beards and skirts, and every step was a protest. The streetlights blur into neon as you step into the late 20th century. The air smells like exhaust, fast food, and protest posters taped to brick walls. You're in the 1980s and 1990s, and the world has sped up. But the fear of sex hasn't gone anywhere. It's just found a new form: disease. You're in the middle of the AIDS crisis, when desire itself became a public enemy, when intimacy was treated as dangerous, and when loving the wrong person could make your name a death sentence. Suddenly sex isn't just criminalized or policed, it's medicalized, politicized, and weaponized. You walk past a clinic in Manhattan. People line up around the corner. Some hold pamphlets. Others hold their lovers' hands tightly. Posters on the walls scream warnings about condoms, blood, and promiscuity. You notice a man sitting on a bench, gaunt and trembling, a bandana around his head. No one speaks his name. He is, and isn't, just another statistic. Here's your historical fact. The HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 1980s disproportionately affected gay men, particularly men of colour. Governments were slow to respond, and media coverage was often sensationalist, framing gay men as vectors of disease rather than as patients in need of care. Fear and stigma led to policies that restricted education, public health responses, and civil rights protections. Condoms became symbols not just of safety, but of shame. And here's your quirky fact. In 1985, the first publicly televised HIV test was broadcast in the US, featuring an anonymous man who took the test live to show viewers that it could be done safely. The goal was to normalise testing, but the broadcast also highlighted the voyeuristic fascination with queer bodies that had fueled public panic for decades. In this era, the laws still hover like ghosts over private behaviour. Sodomy laws remain on the books in many states. Schools teach abstinence-only programs that often frame same-sex activity as immoral or dangerous. Even within communities most affected, fear and secrecy dominate. Men who have sex with men hiding their identities, bisexual people staying silent, trans folks navigating both layers of stigma and legal danger. You wander through New York's West Village, where small bars and community centres become lifelines. Organisations like ACT UP, founded in 1987, transform activism into art, theatre and resistance. Die-ins, protest marches and graffiti disrupt city streets, forcing government officials to listen. The slogan, "Silence equals death," becomes a mantra for survival. People who society had labelled dangerous now reclaim their bodies as political tools. Desire becomes resistance. There's a scholarly debate here. Was the government's slow response to AIDS negligence, prejudice, or a mixture of both? Some historians argue bureaucratic indifference, social stigma, and moral panic created the perfect storm for catastrophe. Others point to intentional political inaction due to fear of angering conservative voters. Either way, the crisis exposed how deeply social control over sexuality remained entrenched, even in supposedly progressive societies. Meanwhile, popular culture begins to reflect and challenge the crisis. Theatre, literature, and film tackle homosexuality, HIV, and intimacy. Tony Kushner's Angels in America portrays both the beauty and the tragedy of love under siege. Queer visibility grows, but danger lingers. Bars are raided, clubs are closed, people are outed, and sometimes they are blamed for their own illness. And yet, even in the fear, desire persists. Lovers cling to each other in hospital rooms. Activists organise bedroom-based safe sex workshops. Friends form chosen families, raising money, sharing information, comforting one another. Sexuality becomes a site of survival. Intimacy becomes activism, and love becomes resistance. You pass a small apartment where a group of queer people of colour gather, laughing quietly, sharing food, creating art. They speak of safer sex, advocacy, and mutual aid. Every hug, every touch, every kiss is political. Every act of intimacy is a statement against erasure, fear, and control. Desire is no longer private, it is public, it is defiant, it is survival. And slowly, the world starts to shift. Condoms become normalised, safe sex campaigns spread, anti-discrimination activism expands. In some places, sodomy laws are challenged, repealed, and overturned. People begin to reclaim the right to love, the right to touch, the right to exist without shame. But the shadow of the crisis remains. Families are torn apart. Communities mourn. Governments lag. Laws, culture, and morality continue to collide. And yet, the movement endures. Desire endures. Humanity endures. So tonight, as you turn off the TV, scroll past a headline about an anti-LGBTQ+ bill, or close your eyes in a quiet apartment, remember this. Even when intimacy is treated as dangerous, even when your body is politicized, people still love. They still resist. They still fight for the right to touch, to kiss, to hold. Desire doesn't vanish. It adapts. It persists. The neon of the city fades, replaced by the sterile glow of a hospital corridor. You're now in the early 2000s, and the world has become hyper-aware of sexuality, health, and legality, but also of technology. Desire has migrated into screens, chat rooms, and encrypted messages. Suddenly, sex isn't just criminalized or policed in public, it's tracked, rated, monitored, and monetized online. The body is both invisible and hyper-visible, private and endlessly scrutinized. And once again, laws struggle to keep pace with human desire. You pass a young couple on a college campus texting under a tree. They're careful. Digital footprints are permanent, and sexting can be prosecuted as a criminal act for minors in some states. A simple image can mean expulsion, imprisonment, or lifelong stigma. Welcome to the age of digital sexuality, where your bedroom can become a courtroom. Here's your historical fact. In the 2000s, US courts increasingly began prosecuting teenagers for sending sexually explicit images of themselves to peers. These sexting laws were often modelled on child pornography statutes, which had originally been designed to protect children from exploitation. The problem? The law didn't distinguish between predatory adults and teenagers sharing images of themselves. Thousands of teens faced criminal records for what was essentially normal sexual exploration. And here's your quirky fact. In some states, schools began installing filters on computers and cameras in classrooms, not just to block pornography, but to monitor email, messaging apps, and even search terms. In one case, a teen was disciplined for Googling how to kiss, because the automated system flagged it as sexual content. Curiosity itself became suspect. Meanwhile, consent education begins to spread, but unevenly. Some schools teach nuanced lessons about sexual ethics, boundaries, and mutual respect. Others preach abstinence only, framing sexual desire as a moral failing. The tension is palpable. One hand tells young people to explore safely, the other tells them that desire itself is dangerous. The result is confusion, shame, and fear, much like it has been across centuries, just now dressed in Wi-Fi and pop culture references. Across the world, the internet also becomes a place for liberation. Queer youth find communities in forums, social media, and private groups. Trans teens discover others who look like them, share stories, and teach one another survival strategies. People with kink or non-traditional sexualities find guides, mentors, and safe spaces. The law lags, as it often does, but the network of human connection expands. Desire adapts faster than repression. There's a scholarly debate here. Does technology empower sexual freedom, or does it intensify surveillance and risk? Some argue that digital spaces allow marginalized communities to explore safely, to form relationships, and to educate themselves. Others point out that the same technology creates unprecedented vulnerability, from revenge porn to hacking to predictive policing. The double-edged sword mirrors centuries of human history. Desire always finds a way, but power structures evolve to monitor it. You walk past a corner coffee shop where a queer book club meets. People are laughing, texting, whispering, sharing stories about dating apps, past crushes and awkward hookups. Each story carries the weight of centuries, laws, punishments, cultural shame, but also the thrill of rebellion, of experimentation, of connection. Desire persists. It finds a space even in a world wired for surveillance. Meanwhile, governments attempt to regulate online sex commerce. Paid content, pornography, and even amateur productions are taxed, censored, or criminalized. Platforms must comply with laws that vary wildly by country. What's legal in one place can get you arrested in another, and yet creators and consumers innovate. VPNs, subscription services, encrypted messaging, tools that echo the hidden courtyards and secret letters of history. Even intimate relationships are shaped by this digital lens. Dating apps, algorithms, and social media influence who you meet, who you see, and how you express desire. Privacy becomes a commodity. Sexuality becomes performative. But behind all the screens, people still fall in love, still explore, still resist. And yet, danger persists. Online predators, non-consensual exposure, revenge porn, and targeted harassment show that the policing of sexuality is as persistent as ever. You realize that technology has changed the scale, but not the underlying dynamics. Bodies, desires, and gender identities remain objects of fascination, fear, and control. As you sit on a rooftop at night, the hum of Wi-Fi and distant traffic filling your ears, you reflect. Sex is still criminalized, policed, shamed, and surveilled in multiple ways. But it also evolves. It slips past borders, screens, and laws. Desire doesn't vanish. It adapts, as it always has, finding cracks in every system, every era, every moral code. And tonight, as your phone buzzes with a message from someone across the city, you understand something clear. Even in the hyper-digital, monitored, legislated age, love and desire remain fiercely human, irrepressible and unstoppable. The city fades behind you, replaced by a stadium full of banners, chants, and rainbow flags. You're in the mid-2000s now, standing in the middle of Pride Month, where sexuality is no longer whispered about or policed behind closed doors. It's performed, celebrated, and weaponized as a statement of freedom. But even in this era of visibility, the shadow of criminalization lingers. Desire isn't fully free. It's still fought over, legislated, and judged. And for millions around the world, simply loving or existing as yourself remains a dangerous act. You're walking down a street lined with rainbow-painted crosswalks. People of every age, race, and gender parade past you, waving, dancing, kissing. Some wear sequins, some wear jeans and t-shirts, some walk with canes, some in wheelchairs, all moving in collective celebration. Yet just a few blocks away, the state could still make your sexuality a criminal matter. A young man holding his boyfriend's hand could be attacked, arrested, shamed. In 70 countries around the world, homosexuality remains illegal, punishable by imprisonment, corporal punishment, or even death. Here's your historical fact. In 2015, the US Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage nationwide in Obergefell vs. Hodges. For the first time, millions of Americans could marry without fear of criminal prosecution, opening a new chapter in the long story of sexuality and the law. Yet, laws protecting marriage didn't automatically erase harassment, employment discrimination, or social stigma. Legal equality and lived experience were still separated by invisible barriers. Here's your quirky fact. During Pride celebrations in the 2010s, some cities reported that rainbow-painted crosswalks were vandalized within days of being installed. Spray paint, tire marks, and hate graffiti reminded everyone that visibility often provokes resistance. Love and celebration became acts of courage, not just joy. Desire itself could be a political act. Meanwhile, technology amplifies both freedom and scrutiny. Social media allows queer communities to connect globally in real time. Hashtags, memes, and viral videos spread education, advocacy, and stories of resistance. At the same time, apps, surveillance tools, and algorithms can expose people to danger. In some countries, dating apps are monitored, entrapment is used, and outing becomes a tool for imprisonment or execution. Visibility can empower, but it can also endanger. There's a scholarly debate here. Has the celebration of LGBTQ+ identity in places like the US, Europe, and Australia genuinely shifted social attitudes? Or has it commodified desire for mainstream consumption while leaving marginalised people exposed to danger? Critics argue that corporate sponsorship of pride often sanitises rebellion into spectacle, diluting the radical history of queer activism. Others argue that visibility, even in commodified form, saves lives by normalising love that was once hidden. Both perspectives reveal the complex balance between liberation and vulnerability. You wander into a pride festival now. Queer youth line up at booths for sexual health, legal advice, and mutual support. Transgender and non-binary individuals speak on panels, advocating for recognition and protection. Elder LGBTQ+ activists recount stories of the AIDS crisis, Stonewall, and anti-cross-dressing arrests. The past and present collide here, creating a landscape of both celebration and caution, joy and remembrance. And yet, danger still lurks outside the safe zones. In some countries, same-sex acts can result in imprisonment or execution. Even in liberal societies, hate crimes, discrimination, and political backlash persist. Desire is still policed, still feared, still judged. Social media amplifies harassment, and laws lag behind the lived realities of marginalised communities. You notice an elderly couple, gay for decades, holding hands. They smile, cautious but proud, aware that their love has endured centuries of repression. Across the street, a group of queer teens dance in the sunlight, laughing as they text friends about meetups. Generations overlap, connected by shared resistance and the defiance of desire. And here's the truth you take with you as the parade passes. Sex, love, and desire have always been intertwined with power, fear, and regulation. Every generation has faced laws, social mores, and violence. Every generation has found ways to love anyway. Today's Pride isn't just a festival. It's a statement that desire cannot be fully policed or silenced. So tonight, as you lie under the glow of neon lights, listening to distant chants and laughter, remember this. Even in the modern age, when visibility is high and laws are more protective, desire remains radical. The act of loving, touching, and existing authentically is still revolutionary. And that persistence, across centuries, is what makes it unstoppable. The celebration fades into the quiet hum of a city at night, and suddenly you're somewhere in the global south. Let's say Nigeria, Uganda, or Jamaica, where the landscape is hot, the air is thick with both humidity and tension, and sex can be a deadly act. Here, love and intimacy exist in the shadows because the law, society, and religion have built walls around desire, walls that can trap, punish, or kill. You're no longer just navigating morality or custom, you're navigating survival. A simple kiss, a discreet touch, even holding hands can be criminalised, stigmatised, and used as evidence against you. Here's your historical fact. In many African and Caribbean nations, laws criminalising same-sex relationships remain rooted in colonial-era penal codes imposed by Britain and other European powers. Section 377 style statutes, often phrased in terms of carnal intercourse against the order of nature, persist decades after independence, carrying sentences ranging from 5 years in prison to life imprisonment. And enforcement is selective, often weaponized against activists, educators, or visible LGBTQ+ individuals. And here's your quirky fact. In Uganda, the Kill the Gays Bill of 2009, though never fully passed into law, included provisions for life imprisonment and even execution for homosexual acts. The bill sparked global outrage, but domestically it was promoted through sensationalized religious rhetoric, highlighting the lingering influence of imported moral panic and the strategic use of sexuality as a political tool. You walk down a dusty street now, men holding hands duck into alleyways, women wink at each other across markets, activists circulate pamphlets with pseudonyms and secret meeting locations. Privacy is survival. Desire exists, but it is carefully coded. Art, literature, and music carry double meanings. Messages hidden in plain sight, understood only by those who need to understand. There's a scholarly debate here. How much of the criminalisation of homosexuality in post-colonial states is indigenous, and how much is a legacy of European colonisation? Some scholars argue that pre-colonial societies had complex, varied attitudes towards sexuality, with fluidity tolerated in certain contexts. Others counter that traditional moral systems often included social sanctions against non-procreative sexual acts. Either way, colonial legal frameworks provided tools to formalize and intensify punishment. And yet, resistance exists. Underground networks provide housing, support, and community. Digital platforms, encrypted chat rooms, dating apps, and social media allow people to connect despite the danger. Hidden safe spaces, both physical and virtual, serve as lifelines. Art, music, and literature become methods of survival, teaching new generations about desire without exposing them to law enforcement or social violence. Meanwhile, religion continues to shape public perception. Evangelical campaigns, homophobic sermons, and political rhetoric frame same-sex desire as sinful, unnatural, and un-African. In some countries, the threat of mob violence looms large, turning even mundane acts of affection into potential life-threatening risks. Desire is criminalized not just by law, but by social fear. You pass a small courtyard at night where queer youth gather secretly. A single candle illuminates a notebook. Inside, someone writes poetry about love that cannot be spoken aloud. Someone else sketches hands brushing together. It's risky, but it's necessary. Desire survives because people make it survive, even when the world tells them it cannot exist. And yet there are victories. Courts occasionally strike down oppressive laws, activists mobilize international attention, and grassroots communities create networks of care. Even in the face of systemic oppression, people love, touch, and resist. Desire refuses to be erased. So tonight, as you rest in the shadows of a city that might punish your very existence, remember this. Sex and intimacy are not just acts. They are acts of courage. Every kiss, every hug, every whispered confession of love is a rebellion. And the human heart across continents and centuries refuses to stop beating, refuses to stop desiring, refuses to stop loving, even when the law demands silence. You step off the dusty streets and into a modern courtroom in 21st century India. The air is electric, filled with reporters, lawyers, activists, and ordinary people who know this moment could change lives. The crowd murmurs, phones click, and somewhere behind the doors, a law that has haunted millions for more than 150 years is finally being challenged. Sex, which has always been policed, criminalized, and moralized in India, is now facing a reckoning. And this time, it's about choice, privacy, and the human right to desire. Here's your historical fact. Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, a colonial-era law criminalizing carnal intercourse against the order of nature, was enacted in 1861 under British rule. For over a century, it criminalized homosexual acts, exposing people to arrests, harassment, and lifelong stigma. Its language was deliberately vague, allowing authorities to target anyone whose sexual behavior deviated from heteronormative expectations. And here's your quirky fact. Prior to its decriminalization, creative workarounds emerged to maintain intimacy. Queer people used coded language, shared poetry, and formed friendship networks that allowed private expressions of affection under the watchful eyes of police and society. Parties, small gatherings, and even rituals based on astrology or theatre became discreet ways to explore relationships, sometimes involving months of careful planning and secrecy. You step into the courtroom, judges deliberate. Lawyers present arguments grounded in the Constitution of India, human rights law, and decades of activism. Public opinion is mixed. Some demand morality, tradition, and the protection of family values. Others demand equality, privacy, and recognition of love in all forms. It's a collision of centuries, colonial laws, cultural norms, and modern ideals clashing in real time. There's a scholarly debate here. Did Section 377 reflect deeply ingrained cultural disapproval of same-sex relationships, or was it primarily a colonial import reinforced by post-independence politics? Some historians argue that pre-colonial Indian society had complex attitudes towards sexuality, with same-sex relationships documented in literature, art, and temple sculpture. Others emphasize that social taboos existed and were amplified by Victorian moral frameworks introduced by British law. Either way, the law became a tool of oppression for generations, and yet, resistance was constant. Activists fought in courtrooms, filed petitions, created organizations, and campaigned internationally. Literature, art, and media pushed boundaries, telling stories of queer love that had survived centuries of criminalization. Legal victories, protests, and personal narratives combined to create momentum that could not be ignored. Here's the pivotal moment. In September 2018, the Supreme Court of India officially decriminalised consensual homosexual acts, striking down the portions of Section 377 that targeted LGBTQ+ individuals. For the first time, millions could legally express desire without fear of criminal prosecution. It was a historic triumph, a rare moment where law and human longing aligned, at least partially. But the work is far from over. Social stigma persists. Hate crimes, discrimination, and familial rejection still threaten people's lives. Desire is not yet fully free, because culture evolves slower than the law. Young people still navigate coded messages, whispered warnings, and generational fear. And yet, the possibility of open love now exists where it once could not. You walk out into the streets of Delhi, past couples holding hands, activists cheering, and the hum of celebration. Signs of struggle remain, walls still carry graffiti, protests continue, and the debate over morality versus freedom rages in classrooms, workplaces, and online. But the law now acknowledges something fundamental, that sexual desire is a human right, not a criminal act. Even in this modern moment, the history of policing, shaming, and criminalising sex lingers like a shadow. But the light of resistance shines brighter. Queer communities celebrate, educate, and continue to push boundaries. Desire, which has always survived centuries of repression, adapts, thrives, and insists on being seen. So tonight, as you walk home under the neon lights, past couples, friends, and strangers, remember this. Sex was once a crime in history, but desire, persistent, relentless, and human, refused to be silenced. It has survived centuries, continents, and empires, and now it begins to live freely, even if imperfectly, in a world finally starting to catch up. The city quiets behind you, and now you're standing in a digital landscape, a globalized world where desire moves faster than governments can legislate. You're in 2025, where sexual expression, technology, and law collide in unprecedented ways. Sex isn't only physical anymore, it's virtual, transactional, algorithmic, and endlessly documented. Desire travels across borders, streaming through encrypted chats, dating apps, and digital content platforms. And yet, the ghost of criminalization still hovers. Even in a hyper-connected world, sex is policed, restricted, and sometimes weaponized. Here's your historical fact. Around the world, laws still exist that criminalize sexual behavior. In some countries, same-sex acts, adultery, or sex work remain illegal, often enforced through digital surveillance raids and targeted arrests. Even private sexual acts can lead to fines, imprisonment, or social exile. Modern technology has expanded enforcement, making it easier to monitor and prosecute intimate acts that were once confined to bedrooms or secret gatherings. And here's your quirky fact. In some countries, algorithms designed to detect child exploitation or obscene content have inadvertently flagged ordinary sexting, adult dating, or even sex-positive educational material. Automated systems, while intended to protect, often reproduce centuries of moral panic, punishing desire without understanding context. A private consensual image can become evidence against you, even decades after the act. Technology doesn't erase historical policing, it amplifies it. You navigate the apps, forums, and platforms that define modern intimacy. Dating services match people by algorithms, while social media amplifies both acceptance and shaming. Conversations about consent, pleasure, and sexual identity have become mainstream, but so have surveillance, doxing, and moral judgment. Desire in this landscape is simultaneously celebrated and criminalized. It exists everywhere, yet remains precarious. There's a scholarly debate here. Does digital connectivity empower sexual freedom, or does it intensify risk? Advocates argue that online communities allow marginalized groups to connect, explore, and educate safely. Critics caution that surveillance, censorship, and corporate control introduce new forms of coercion, policing, and risk. The paradox mirrors history. Liberation is always accompanied by scrutiny. Meanwhile, global activism continues. Movements like #MeToo, #FreeTheNipple, and international campaigns for LGBTQ+ rights highlight how sexual expression is entwined with power, consent, and visibility. People fight to protect privacy, bodily autonomy, and freedom of expression. Sex isn't just a private act anymore. It's a political and cultural battleground, and activists are redefining norms in real time. You wander through a digital forum now, reading stories of love, intimacy, and courage. People share experiences of queer identity, transgender affirmation, kink exploration, and consensual experimentation. Desire becomes community, education, and resistance. Hidden histories resurface, letters, art, oral histories, and recorded testimonies that prove what historians suspected all along. Sex has always existed, even under threat, and humans have always found a way to claim it. Even in this era, danger persists. Some nations arrest citizens for private sexual activity. Corporate and government surveillance monitor content. Cyber harassment threatens safety. Legal systems lag behind technology. But across platforms, activists, allies, and ordinary people push back. Desire evolves faster than control, finding new forms, new codes, and new networks. As you scroll past stories, gifs, and discussions, you realize that history has taught the same lesson over and over. Criminalization of sex never eradicates desire. It forces it underground, into coded language, secret spaces, and encrypted messages. But it never succeeds in erasing it. Humans keep loving, touching, and connecting, no matter the laws, the punishments, or the centuries of moral panic. So tonight, as you close your laptop and lie under the soft hum of a fan, reflect on this. Sex was a crime in history. From ancient Rome to colonial India, from Puritan Massachusetts to Victorian England, from enslaved plantations to digital chat rooms. And yet, desire survived. It persisted, adapted, and resisted. And in this modern, hyper-connected world, it thrives, reminding us that human intimacy, love, and longing are unstoppable forces, resilient across every era.